Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. I have taken up the bad habits of my students of using my phone now to read my notes, so it's convenient, I have to admit. So let me take a look. Welcome to the first panel of our two-day event on mobilization democracy. So in this first session, we will hear three presentations that examine different aspects of democratic life and political participation, from ideological frameworks and state responses to protest to local form of the civic engagement. So each speaker will have between 20 and 25 minutes for their presentation, followed by a short discussion with the public. So we'll be beginning with, I'll do quick brief presentations of our speakers. We'll be beginning with Dr. Philip Gray, an independent scholar currently based in Ohio. He has previously held academic positions at Texas A&M University in Qatar, the US Coast Guard Academy, and several universities in Hong Kong. His research focuses on political ideologies, particularly vanguardism, as well as ethics in public administration. His talk will be entitled "The Needs, Not the Wants of the People," and will explore how vanguardist and technocratic approaches have shaped certain understandings of democracy. For our second speaker, we'll have our very own Dr. Damilola Agbalachubi, who has recently been promoted to professor of political science at Obafemi Awolowo University in Nigeria, and is currently a senior research fellow here at the Bogota Hub. Her work addresses a range of issues, including gender, political participation, and governance in Africa. And her presentation, Bullets, Batons, and Silence, she will examine the Nigerian state's response to the 2024 End Bad Governance protests. And we will then hear from Dr. Jamie Black, Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Notre Dame. She works on topics related to democratization, civil society, and citizenship, with a particular focus on Mali and West Africa. Her presentation, Associational Membership, Deliberation, and Public Goods Provision, looks at how forms of everyday social interaction can influence civic engagement and access to service. So please join me in welcoming our first speaker, Dr. Philip Gray.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the Hub for the invitation. Thank you, Massimo, for the invitation. Just as a start, I have to admit I have never worked in this elevation before. So if I should pause for a couple of minutes, I'm just catching my breath. My apologies. I will make my best effort to not have a heart attack while doing this presentation. So today, needs and not the wants of the people. So the research that I'm going to be presenting is focused specifically, and forgive me for the lack of PowerPoint, old-fashioned. While much of the discussion today focuses on the threats to democracy from populist authoritarianism, or say the things you see with Donald Trump, the Fidesz party in Hungary, other groups of this type, this paper is focused a little bit more on what might be a less obvious danger, but one that may be arising and may have been arising for some time, specifically from more vanguardist or technocratic forms of discourse or organization that are somewhat below the surface, but still have influence, especially in areas of the West. To start with, though, I want to focus on two parts of, or two elements of democratic discourse, democratic theory, to flesh out a little bit about where the dangers from vanguardism or technocracy arise. Obviously, democratic discourse has a great deal of elements within it, but the two I'm focusing on particularly are isonomia and on objective interests. So isonomia, coming from the ancient Greek, originally arising in Hippocratic medical texts, usually emphasizes the idea of equality, but there's also implicit in it a certain notion of sameness. What makes you, the people, part of a democracy? Especially looking at, say, ancient Greece, the sameness and equality was a little easier to try and equate each other because limits on citizenship made it a little bit simpler. If you were a male, if you were a Greek speaker, if you were of the Greek ethnicity, all of these sorts of things, you would be part of that group. Dealing with modern democracy, dealing with multi-ethnic, multi-linguistic, multi-gender, all of these types of elements in democracy, isonomia still remains. The issue of who are we as a society, who are we as a democracy still remain, but the adjustment to it is a little bit more difficult in trying to determine what that means. The second element is objective interests. So if you have a population, you have a people, you have a democracy, is there any kind of interest that's combining them together? Or is it a grouping of subjective interests that are kind of slamming into each other, trying to come to some negotiated peace, like you would see in pluralism, or say Madison's Federalist 10 being the best example of this notion of various interests trying to work together to come to some negotiated compromise. Versus again, at least at points looking to ancient Greece or other areas where the idea is that as a people, what groups you together is you do have certain types of objective interests outside of the subjective interests of any individual person or group. So might be something like security or sanitation, even something as basic as that. The reason for focusing on these two, while obviously democracy has much more involved with it, is that these two areas tend to be the weak points for democracy when facing something like vanguardism or technocracy. So nice. Keep using these terms, vanguardism, technocracy. So what am I talking about? We'll start with vanguardism first. So vanguardism, usually when people think of a vanguard party, they're thinking of the Bolsheviks. They're thinking of Lenin, the group of Bolshevik revolutionaries who take over Russia, start the Soviet Union, so on and so forth. In my analysis, vanguardism is a broader type of organizational and ideological structure, in a sense. So this would be inclusive of, say, if we're looking at regime types, it would be inclusive of, say, the Bolsheviks, creation of the Soviet Union, Nazi Germany, fascist Italy, effectively what oftentimes we think of in terms of totalitarian regimes of some type or another. While there are generally 6 traits in vanguardism that are important, for our purposes here, I'm only going to focus on 3. And forgive the overly wordy first one, but I couldn't think of a better term for it. First, the epistemologically privileged category. Second, science. And third, the vanguard party itself. One of the key elements in vanguardism is the notion that a certain mass population has a unique trait or a unique place or position within the ongoing dynamic of history. So again, if we go to the Bolsheviks, typical example that the proletariat is in this unique historical position to move to a new sort of society, a new type of post-capitalist classless society, so on and so forth. But the mass population itself can be almost anything. It can be based on nation. It can be based on race. It can be based on religion. The key element with it is that this mass population has this central role to play in the story of history, the true engine of how human interaction works. And in particular, that this population is the only one that can truly see how this history operates. So it would be a little bit like, imagine you're looking at something like a Monet painting, a nice, fresh, a nice painting with all sorts of different colors and so forth. You have a group of us watching it, looking at it, but there is only one person who has color vision. This is the only person who can actually see the painting. Everyone else sees something, they see outlines, but they can't see it purely. In the sort of vanguardist idea, the notion is this mass population, the proletariat, the Aryan race, the Italian nation, whatever, truly sees what's there. Everyone else is blind, to a sense. This allows them to have a sort of science of this history. Dialectic materialism, Darwinian evolution doesn't really matter in many ways, just this notion that you can understand the actual dynamics of how history is working. All nice, except the third element of this, the vanguard party itself. Yes, this mass population, this category of individuals, does have access to reality, but most of them can't see it. Notion of false consciousness, or the idea that they have been so beaten down by the evil present that they just can't actually see this truth. They're blinded by it. False consciousness, led astray, so on and so forth. The Vanguard Party, this group of professional revolutionaries, the tip of the spear, the advanced wing of the advanced population, its purpose is to push that population along, to effectively show it what its true interests are, what its true abilities are, to push it towards this task of social revolution, to try and bring about the new world, the new man, what have you. Now, in a way, this doesn't necessarily seem like something that would have much to do with democracy. Vanguard parties are not known for exactly being democratic. Generally speaking, the notion is if you understand the science of history, whatever that science should be, that gives you legitimacy. Elections are irrelevant. That said, why this becomes an issue for democratic discourse is because along the elements of isonomia and objective interests, vanguardism can make a case that it is much more democratic than typical democracy. First, it does actually say that there is a population. What makes us who we are? Who are we? We are the proletariat. We are the Aryan race. We are the oppressed, what have you. That there is an identity trait that links all of these individuals together. And that way makes them the same and to an extent makes them equal. Even in viciously hierarchical types of vanguardist systems, there is this element to it. So let's give the example of Nazi Germany or the Nazi ideology. Within the Aryan race, there are going to be, those who are more pure, those who are less, those who are better eugenically, those who are worse. But there is a key sort of quantum distinction between being part of this race and being outside of it. That even the lowliest Aryan is still equal to the highest Aryan because he's better than those inferior races that are underneath him. That there is still this equality even in these hierarchical types of systems. This is something that vanguardism tends to try and use to say that it is actually focused on a real people, a people that can be identified. Secondly, and rather obviously, is the element of objective interests. Very basis of vanguardism is that this population has an objective role in history to serve. The problem being the population oftentimes doesn't see it. Therefore, you need this vanguard party. You need these professional revolutionaries to push this population along, with the notion being that hopefully, as time would go on, the population itself, this mass category of individuals, would start to see reality as it actually is. That theoretically, after the social revolution, after this is passed, there wouldn't be a need for a vanguard party because the population itself would know what is needed. Obviously, that's going to be far off. That's far off to the future. But the notion is that at least potentially these populations could get to know their own objective interests. And the idea is that this is more holistically democratic in the sense of that the vanguard is trying to bring people to their true interests rather than just playing a game of addition or terminology that would oftentimes be used in earlier periods, having a mechanistic or mechanical notion of democracy where you're just counting votes. No, well, actually, it's the substance of it is the idea of the vanguardists. Now, we'll get a little bit more to the threats in a moment, just to make sure to keep on time in all of this. The other type of potential threat comes from technocracy. So rule by those who know, rule by those who have knowledge. Now, the first and biggest issue in talking about technocracy is unlike dealing with vanguardist groups, we have no concrete existent examples of a technocratic regime. We have governments that have had a technocratic nature, have had technocratic elements, but one is hard-pressed to find a regime that's lasted for any real length of time that has specifically based itself on the technocratic notion that we are legitimized by our knowledge, purely by our science, in fact. That said, there has certainly been a significant amount of technocratic influence, both whether you're dealing with, say, Western nations, can see that somewhat to the Soviet Union in its later periods or other types of regimes, the sort of notion of expertise as a legitimating force. Now, when talking about technocracy, one of the key elements to keep in mind is the centrality of method. That technocracy, typically, if we're looking at it or trying to look at it analytically, one oftentimes see various tropes or registers that are used to try and legitimate technocracy. So it can be something like Newtonian physics, Darwinian evolution, engineering, social engineering methods, quantum mechanics, ecology, that effectively you have these types of tropes or registers to give an example of what the science is supposed to look like. In practice, generally people aren't using the elements of thermodynamics to try and figure out how to run public policy. This is a term to try and bring about legitimation. So instead, the focus tends to be on a method that attempts to bring greater centralization, bureaucratization, and standardization into a technocratic system or into a system. Now, the big challenge for technocracy in dealing with democratic discourse is, at least when dealing with isonomia, there is basically very little of isonomia inside technocracy. You have those who know and those who don't. I have a DJ. That's kind of nice. I definitely appreciate it. Now, in particular, actually in future lectures, I think I actually should have something like that. It would probably make it feel a lot better, honestly.
You can just laugh. No.
Now, along with this type of standardization, one of the key elements in the focus on method is the idea of attempting to make political questions into technical questions. So the key element is to try and make any type of thing that could cause contestation into something that's merely a technical issue. So, I mean, in some ways, sort of the reverse of that old phrase that's usually attributed to Werner von Braun, of when someone asked him about whether or not he had felt bad about being part of the V2 program after he was working for the US space program. And his response was, I am an engineer. My job is to make sure that the rockets come up. Where they land is a political question. In a sense, try to remove the political questions as much, just make them technical questions as much as possible. Again, there's not much in the way of isonomia technically within technocracy. However, as time has gone on, especially more recent discourses with it, there's at least the notion that the general population might be able to at least broadly understand the method that's necessary for trying to bring about a better society. They may not understand it as well as, say, the Council of Engineers or whoever would be running it. But the idea is there aren't really that much in the way of natural differences. So theoretically, if you could create a society where many of the inequalities based on lack of nutrition, socioeconomic issues, lack of education, and so forth, the notion is that many of these types of differences might start to vanish, or at least lessen to an extent. Now, technocracy's greatest strength deals with objective interests. So if we look to say one of the best examples of someone who was explicitly writing as a technocrat, a man named William Henry Smythe, back in just after World War I, his argument effectively is that the problem the population has is that even if it wants to try and reach its own interests, oftentimes it lacks capability to, because it just doesn't have the understanding of the proper methods to do so. Just like an example he would give is just like most people would like to actually have power generation, but if you put most people in front of a generator, they will have no idea how to make it, how to maintain it, how for it to function. It's just a technical issue. The strength technocracy has is in making this argument that it can provide those sort of technical responses, and particularly in a very advanced industrial democracy, the notion is that this is what's needed. Much more so than things like elections or usual kind of contestations inside a legislature, you need someone who can actually be a technician. In a different context, forgive me for paraphrasing from memory, there was a public administration scholar by the name of Dwight Waldo who at one point had sort of emphasized this point for administration in government. Recall his exact phrase was, the price of democracy after hours is autocracy during working hours. The administrators are the ones who are going to keep things running so you can have your nice democratic elements after work. Now, for both of them, both Waldo and for Smythe, one of the things that points to a major empty point in technocracy is that oftentimes there is this notion that what's driving it is some type of legitimating purpose, national purpose, some later on the efficiency, for others, maximization of economic productivity, for others, occasionally something like ecology. Generally speaking, technocracy is usually able to strengthen itself by making the argument that it can provide what's needed, but it can never provide necessarily the legitimation for what is needed. Now, before moving on, there is one subsection of technocracy that does need a little bit of special mention. It's been called the new class or managed democracy or things of this type, but probably the easiest term for it would be managerial. Or in other words, for this one, the idea is the science that's under consideration is the science of organization. And this one is somewhat unique compared to other forms of technocracy in that it's actually had a certain level of success. And so the new class initially being discussed in post-Stalin Soviet Union, managed democracy and managerialism being focused on the West, especially during the Cold War and into the period afterwards, generally has had two major strengths to it that will become relevant later. One is that it's much more clear exactly how the science is concerned with touches on governance. If you're basing technocracy, again, in earlier forms on Newtonian physics or Darwinian evolution, that's great, but metallurgy and thermodynamics don't really tell you much about how to do policy. The science of organization does. The second, and probably its most powerful trait, is that it has an exceptional ability to self-replicate. This, compared to other forms of technocracy or oftentimes other forms of government, is what gives it some of its strength. So even if some problem arises in a managerial system, so if you're looking at a corporation, a government organization, or what have you, oftentimes the solutions are more managerial. So pretty much anyone who's worked in any modern organization is probably familiar with this. There is some problem of a lack of efficiency, so what do? You form a committee. You make a lot more standard operating procedures. You may make an additional 2 or 3 departments in order to try and make sure you're more efficient by doubling the size of what you have. Practically, we can look at that and say that sounds insane. But if one's using this particular kind of method, it is making it more efficient. You are efficiently using the means of organization to try and make that organization more efficient to be an organization, even if objectively it seems a little nuts. That's been one of its greatest strengths. Now, for both vanguardism and technocracy, they do have some overlaps. They do have some overlaps, particularly in terms of, well, actually, let's leave aside the overlaps. Let's move on more to the concerns. Because on the one hand, I mean, it's nice as an academic exercise to say, okay, when we talk about these discourses, but does it really matter? I mean, outside of, say, looking at some things like certain types of religious vanguardism, particularly in the Middle East or areas like that, vanguardism doesn't seem to quite have the strength it used to. It's not like the early part of the 20th century where it's taking over major industrial countries. Technocracy has kind of remained what it always is. Why would we care about this? Because of the possibility that a kind of synthetic ideology and organizational structure is forming. It has been forming for probably since about the mid-1970s. Big weakness of vanguardism is it requires some sort of strong social crisis, some major existential crisis, usually to have an effect and actually be able to gain power. But it does have the ability to say who you are as a people and where you're going. Technocracy, its great strength is that it's very effective at trying to make things move, but it lacks any real legitimating purpose underneath it. So what happens if you merge them? So the idea would be looking particularly in the period of 1970s going on, and especially at the end of the Cold War, after the Soviet Union's basically collapsed as a competitor, you start to see in terms of personnel as well as in terms of certain types of structures, a merging getting to occur. So, I mean, it's used in a different context. A man named Danforth put it in this way, that you have situations where social justice discourse acts as the moral force, technocratic discourse acts as the political force. So when you see, say, certain types of, say, non-governmental organizations or certain types of agencies where you see a significant amount of contact between private corporations, non-governmental organizations, government agencies, that in terms of their at least explicit moral direction seem to have more vanguardist elements to them, specifically aiming towards dealing with assisting the oppressed while also integrating pretty easily into a neoliberal technocratic capitalistic system. Something, well, forgive me using this sort of example, but particularly about 2 years ago, one would hear, at least in certain contexts of the United States, the idea of something like woke capital, the odd situation where you have a highly viciously neoliberal type of capitalistic organization that is also platforming Black Lives Matter, trans rights, this and the other things that seem to be much more social justice oriented and not at all focused on, say, neoliberal economics, also combined with a technocratic organization that is very much so. Initially, the idea is, could this have just been, marketing? My argument, which we'll just have to leave just a pause at this, is that potentially this isn't just marketing, that we might be seeing some type of new organization forming, one that doesn't have a name yet, that manages to integrate elements of managerial technocratism and subaltern forms of vanguardism. That may not be the greatest threat to democracy now, but it might be later, just because the concern is that these may seem like organizations that are trying to save democracy while actually undermining them. So if one is focusing on, say, elements going on in the United States or Hungary or El Salvador, then one might be looking for allies who are actually not allies at all. That brings me to time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gray, and for the scrupulous respect of time constraints. We'll now move to Dr. Damilola Balajobi's presentation entitled Bullets, Batons, and Silence, Analyzing the State's Response to the 2024 End Bad Governance Protests in Nigeria.
Yeah, thank you very much. I titled my presentation Bullets, Batons, and Silence, Analyzing the State Response to the 2024 End Bad Governance Protests in Nigeria. In Nigeria, in recent times, we had a couple of increased citizen-led protests. And this is actually against systematic issues ranging from economic mismanagement, widespread corruption, and of course, social injustice. And this is not the first of its kind. Over the years, Nigeria has had a rich history of activism, which actually shapes the country's political landscape and has the potential to actually foster transformation in the light of persistent political challenges we have had over the years and different kind of unrest in Nigeria. And so what is actually different is that in recent times, we have the Nigerian youth utilizing and leveraging the digital platforms and unity of shared frustration have consistently turned to mass mobilization as a tool for them to express their dissent and actually demand accountability from the government. And that's what is actually different. And so we had the End SARS movement of 2020, particularly that marked a turning point in activism in Nigeria because of how it happened. And so we have had scholars arguing that the social media platform was actually very important and crucial for spreading messages about the End SARS protest that was actually what happened. And that actually ushered in recounting their experiences and that of their friends on social media about different cases of police brutality and then corruption and other injustice that actually happened. But one thing that was actually important is that the manner of response to protests by the Nigerian government over time has been actually characterized by more of disdain and in many cases violent deterrence instead of listening to the agitation of the people. And so despite the fact that we have a constitutional guarantee of free expression and assembly, the Nigerian government approach to civil unrest seems to be characterized by suppression, violence, and impunity. And so we have art scholars describe what Nigerian government has especially did on the 29th of May 2024, for example. They banned all the Bring Back Our Girls protest demonstration that happened in Abuja with the claim that the protest posed a security threat to citizens. So that's what some of the things we see. Instead of listening, they tend to turn it around against the citizens. And so there's this argument that during the NSAS protest, they use very heavy firearm against unarmed protestants, and that actually escalated and actually led to conflict, civil disobedience, and of course, they then began to demand for change of government. The 2024 End Bad Governance protests actually exposed this kind of recurring pattern, where rather than engaging the people to listen to the demands of the people, they tend to respond with force and intimidation against the people. And so this is why I'm actually interested in asking the question, given the fact that we have had series of protests. For example, we had the Bring Back Our Girls in 2014, we had the NSAS protests in 2020. In 2024, we had 3 different kinds of protests. We had the Reject Finance Bill, we had the End Femicide, then we have the End Bad Governance. The question is, are we progressing or regressing? And so when we look at the overview of the 2024 End Bad Governance, that protest actually erupted across major cities in Nigeria between the 1st of August and 10th, 2024. And so the protestants actually outlined 10 demands. And they maintained that Nigerians were fed up with bad governance, corruption, the rising cost of living, and that left millions of people struggling while the nation's resources were being obviously mismanaged without sincere accountability. And so this was actually triggered by the removal of subsidy. When the present administration came on board, the first thing he did on the first day he resumed office was to remove subsidy. And that actually escalated inflation that followed. And of course, rapid decline in standard of living across the country. And so that sole action of removing fuel subsidy was, of course, they felt it was necessary over the years because even the past administration had been talking about it. But coming on board of this present administration, actually, and removing subsidy kind of turned a bitter pill for the people. And of course, it increased fuel price from 400 to 1,000 per liter. And instantly that day, like if people were waiting, the price of things changed. Dollar increase, everything just changed simultaneously. And that created inflation, food inflation. Many businesses had to shut down. And that was what triggered this actually, the bad governance process. So those who want to protest, the government said they can protest and we will be eating. It was like, that was a statement made by the present Senate President, Governor Akpabio. And it showed that the Nigerian government were kind of, their response to the protestant was like, it was indifferent. They didn't care about what the people were going through. And so in the week and days prior to the commencement of the protest, the government spent time trying to mobilize traditional rulers, governors of each state, influential figures to ensure that citizens were dissuaded from joining the protest. Instead of trying to listen to the people, to the demand of the people, all they did was try to persuade the people not. So just as a response from the Nigerian state towards the NSAS protest, the same thing they did. And so they decided to, put heavily armed security men, personnel across in the cities, major cities. And so just to ensure that the people did not go on this protest. And so and then investigation showed that a lot of people, so that as to avoid people from coming out, they killed some people. At least 24 people, Protestants in Kano, in Katsina, in Jigawa, Kaduna, Niger, and Borno State were killed. And so the Nigerian police force, in an official release, refuted these reports, however, claiming they were unfound, misleading, inconsistent with the incident. And then it was obvious because people saw it even on the social media. Also, instead of them claiming and trying to find a way of persuading the people, all they kept saying that the protesters were criminals, they were terrorists. I know. So, for instance, some suspected Boko Haram operative, they claim infiltrated the protest and detonated IED in Borno State and killed so many people. But of course, we know that the government had actually sent out people, deployed personnel to actually cause harm. And so we have had evolutions of this kind of repression in Nigeria. This wasn't the first time in Nigeria. And most of the governors in the state affected declared curfews to restore normalcy. However, despite this state repression, because it's not new and is rooted in some of the things that have happened in the past, in the eras in Nigeria, it was all in a bid to control dissenting opinions, in a bid to neutralize oppressions as much as possible against the people, which is some of the things they do. And of course, we have had cases like that happening during military regimes in the past in Nigeria, adopting repressive strategy as well as using decrees, censorship, secret police, indefinite detention of people who they know are very pivotal to those protests against, instead of listening to the people. And of course, in 1999, also in Nigeria, we had such cases. And so we have had cases like this where they use some of these weapons to stop the people from protesting. But what is the role of social media in this mobilization and suppression? Platforms like X, known as Twitter, Facebook, and WhatsApp, amidst others, actually played a long role in empowering citizens to voice out their grievances, to coordinate the protestants, the activities, and hold the state accountable. And so it's actually, for example, the social media then serve as a two-edged sword, for example, positively and negatively. For example, there was this hashtag NSAS, End Bad Governance, that actually brought people together during this time, regardless of the geographical, regardless of the ethnic division. And this kind of created a collective identity for the people, built on the basis of the shared struggle. It didn't matter where you're from, it didn't matter your religion or whatever. And so the decentralized nature of the social media made it difficult for authorities to contain the movement as leadership was fluid and information kept spreading rapidly for the people. And so in case of the 2024 End Bad Governance, the social media served as an energy of mobilization. And so we saw that the End Bad Governance protest, we saw that the mobilization was basically done on social media. And engagement of young people was basically done on the social media, serving not as a tool for mobilization alone, but also for organization and coordination. And so, but the Nigerian government itself was also using this same media to counter measures in response to the use of social media during the protest. And we had cases of reporting initiatives that were reported. Coalition of various youth and cyber crimes organizations who attested to the fact that the government was trying to use this medium also to disrupt, and by what they did was trying to disrupt internet connection and access to, so that people could not have access to internet during the period. And so I tried to interview people, and it was important for us to listen to the voice of the people who were actually protestants in this case, and try to interview people across the different regional locations within Nigeria. And I would like you to listen to some of their voices and their narratives regarding the NSAS process. And one of the things that I brought out 5 major thematic issues from the interviews I did with the people. And first and foremost is the living condition of structural neglect. The reasons why the End Bad Governance protest took place. The living condition across all the narrative that we heard, participants constantly expressed that the 2024 protests were not, triggered by a single incident. That actually as a result of the things that have actually been happening over the years, because, it's a accumulation of long-standing experience of state abandonment and structural neglect. And this actually ended up in manifesting in food scarcity, insecurity, unaffordable education, widespread unemployment, failed public infrastructure. And these are the things that actually triggered these end bad governance protests. And so some of the people said, what drove them to the street, for example, quoting somebody, wasn't just one event, 5 minutes more. Oh, but the fact that the government seems to have failed them. And so that was one of the things that triggered them to. And secondly, the social media actually served as a double-edged sword. And, you know, the pivotal role of the social media in this protest was unmistakably, it had a very, because everything around the protest was organized online. It was easy for the people to coordinate themselves, even though they were not in the same region. And some of the participants said so. And so the social media made it possible to reach people quickly. It wasn't just about mobilizing. It was used to educate, to share what the protest stood for. And that was why they were able to share the 10 demands across the different across the nation. And of course, another thing that was important was repression and the expanding tactics of state control. Instead of them listening to the demands of the people, they were repressing. In Ibadan, for example, the protest was peaceful this time, but the claim was very fragile because people were seeing policemen all around, throwing tear gas, and so it was a challenge for the people to even mobilize themselves in some cases. And then, of course, there was this use of disinformation as a tool of legitimizing the claims of the people. And so the government and the media outlets kept pushing the ideas that they were puppets. People who were organizing the puppet were used by some other people instead of accepting the claims that people were agitating sincerely for a change of situations. And then lastly, civic renewal amid fragmentation and fear. The protest wasn't just a reaction. It was part of something bigger, something accumulated because of what had happened in the past, especially because of NSAS protests. So it showed that people had not lost hope because it showed that people could come together despite their location, because one of the things that Nigeria ethnicity, religion seems to draw people apart. But the end bad governance showed that people could come together for a single struggle despite their religion or their ethnic affiliation. And so important for us to understand that the 2024 end bad governance protest was beyond just a highlight of civil unrest. Rather, it reflected a more deep-seated, enduring crisis of governance, accountability, and civil engagement in Nigeria. And so this evidence brought forward by this study has shown that the state's response to the protest was characterized by violent crackdown. They didn't listen to the people. And of course, it's still something that is deep-seated in Nigeria today, that if there's any protest in recent times, people will still come out because the government has not given the people the opportunity to listen to them. And that's one of the, so in the midst of this repression, young Nigerians, like every other economically and politically marginalized group in the country, continue to assert their presence. And that is what they are seeing today. And that is what the end bad governance protest has shown. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Agbola-Jubia. Yeah. Yes, I think so.
I think he's just on the background. Yeah. I don't think I can. Do you know if I can move this? Oh, got it. Perfect. Thank you. Okay. Hello? Great. Thank you, everyone. And thank you so much for the invitation to come present today. This is a current book project that I'm in the process. I've just got reviews back, so I'm revising right now. So I could very much use all of your feedback. And I'm so excited to have scholars from different regions of the world looking at this, because this is a project based on 18 months of fieldwork in Mali, but very much based on literature from the American, but also I'd say more sub-Saharan African context. So today I want to talk about associational membership, deliberation, and public goods provision in Mali, thinking about how this shapes civic engagement. And this is, as I said, let's see. Oops. Great. Yeah, so this is part of a book project called Searching for Democracy in the Wrong Places, Informal Clubs, Social Capital, and Civic Engagement in Mali. Three of the chapters are co-authored with economists, actually, Jacobo Bonan, Philippe Lemay-Boucher, and Bassirou Sarr. So I wanted to give them a shout out before I continue on. But essentially, for those of you that follow the news about Mali, you've probably heard that after almost 20 years of multi-party democracy, in the last decade or so, there have been 3 coups, there's an active insurgency. And so all of this is in background, but I want to sort of divert our attention to more everyday practices and grassroots spaces, particularly a form of social club called a GREN locally. And I'm going to ask this question: what's the impact of membership in informal tea drinking clubs on Malian society? Very much thinking about these spaces as third places, if you know sort of Oldenburg's argument about really relaxed, informal, egalitarian spaces where people come and hang out. And the book makes 3 arguments about the way that these groups not just help members, but also help Malian society more broadly. So one is in terms of youth resilience, very much relying on some of the mechanisms highlighted by political scientists and sociologists related to bridging and bonding. What I'm going to talk about today a little bit is citizenship skills and civic engagement, and then also social cohesion, which I'm happy to talk more about in the Q&A. Oops. So I only have 20 minutes, so I'm going to try to speed through this. Oops. Okay, but essentially, there's a large literature, right, that says associational life should really be important and matter for civic engagement. Citizens can gain sort of skills, efficacy, are able to triangulate information. And something I want to really highlight here, because I'm going to come back to it again and again when I talk about GREN, is something that's very interesting about GREN is they bring together diverse groups of people, both socioeconomically, across ethnic groups, across regional homelands. So in that sense, they're able to bridge weak ties across Malian society. So I think that's a very important attribute of these groups. And so therefore, both the bridging and the bonding that happens in these groups can build social trust and trustworthiness, but also a type of democratic civility that can potentially thwart the types of effective polarization that we see in other places. Okay. I'll jump over this, but a lot of times, at least in the sub-Saharan African context, we focus a lot on formal groups, in part because they're very legible, right? If you went and you say, what does civil society look like? You might pull a registry of civil society organizations. And so part of what I want to do in this project is make these informal spaces more legible and put them in this broader conversation. And so when we think about civil society, there's been a lot of work in thinking about them in terms of their role in welfare provision, also watchdogs of government, right? Group advocacy. There's a wonderful Francophone political science literature on sort of the politics from below and thinking about how these groups really help members contextualize and understand their space or position as citizens. But I want to sort of broaden this out and think about the potential impacts of membership in these groups on society more broadly. We know, right, associational membership sometimes can have bad outcomes for democracy. Groups can build in-group identity to the detriment of non-members, right? They can foster more particularistic identities that create discrimination or exacerbate inequality. And so there's some folks who are skeptical that bonding sort of between groups in the global south could have this sort of broader societal impact in a positive way. So very quickly on Mali, as I mentioned, we have a period of multi-party elections between, started, though there is a coup for democracy in 1991, then you have multi-party elections, 1992 to 2012. 2012, there's a coup largely in response to the government's mismanagement of growing insurgency in the north in the wake of the fall of Gaddafi in Libya. Then elections are restored in 2013. The period of research is between 2014 and 2015. So we can talk more in the Q&A about where Mali is now versus where Mali is when I completed this research. But at the time of research, there's sort of active insurgents, including jihadist groups. But again, all that stuff is more in the news. And I also want to Mali has a really strong reputation also for a long history of decentralized governance and informal institutions fostering conflict mitigation. So those of you might have heard of cousinage or sanincluya, as we say in Bambara, but also a tradition of consensus-based discussion, sort of as a cornerstone of rural politics, not unlike many other places in Africa. Okay, so the question I want to ask today is membership and GRAN associated with greater civic engagement. And to conduct this research, I was in Mali for 18 months, 2014 and 15, with a team of amazing research assistants. Just to give you a sense of how we did the study, we started out with ethnographic observations to even understand how you draw the conceptual boundaries around what these groups are, right? And then we did a series of things first in the capital of Bamako, and then we moved up to Mopti, which at the time is sort of the border of where there was a lot of insurgent movement. And so in each city, we first conducted a census of household members. So I can talk about sampling and all that fun stuff in the Q&A, but essentially we went into neighborhoods and tried to get a sense of if you pull a household and you ask that household about members that are between 18 and 45, we wanted to know basic demographics of the household members, but also we wanted to know if any of those household members were members of a GREN. And so then we used this as our base to create a randomized sample of these groups. And we also were able to get some demographic characteristics of members and non-members, right? So then later we used this list. We called people up and said, hey, we're a group of social scientists and we'd love to come visit your group. And I don't know the Colombian equivalent, but what I'm presenting in the US, I say, it's like if you were calling someone and asking if you could visit their Monday night football club. So like a really informal sort of space where people are like watching sports and talking shit. And so people were a little surprised. That works? Okay. Okay. So yeah, so people were surprised. I mean, overwhelmingly, we were sort of welcomed in, and this is sort of a reflection of Malian culture as well. So we did a survey of 375 groups, and then we returned to the groups to do individual surveys of members and also play some experimental games that I'm not going to show today. And then finally, the part that I'm going to focus on mostly for the remaining 15 or so minutes of the presentation is we did then 66 focus groups with out-of-sample group GREN to try to understand some of the mechanisms or the ways that people understood their own, like if they were asked essentially, what is the impact of membership? You know, what if people are members, the good, the bad, what does this do for society? Okay, so as I mentioned, we started out with this sort of ethnography, and then after we did these ethnographies, I had many of the research assistants who were in fact members of these groups write essays about what it means to be a member of a GREN, what is a GREN? And then we triangulated all this information. We had a big whiteboard session where we sort of came up with a list of what the attributes are. As I said, we also did a group survey, and that's going to tell us more about the composition and the attributes of the groups. Survey data so that we can compare members and non-members, right? And so we can say, at least in terms of correlations, if you're a member, does that mean that you're more politically knowledgeable? Does that mean that you participate more often, right? And then finally, the focus group transcripts, we're going to use that to try to understand if there are if we do see heightened civic engagement, what's driving that? Just a picture of Bamako. Okay, so these are the sort of tenets of a GREN. So one, it's a space where members sit and drink tea or another beverage, but really usually this really strong, sweet tea. There has to be free discussion among members. So people have to feel that sense of sort of freedom of expression. There have to be regular meetings independent of other events. And so I'll say it now in case I forget later, but Mali has very weak political parties. So compared to other contexts where we see these types of political discussion groups, very few have a formal relationship with a political party, and groups feel very much this, or at least they express, wanting to be independent of any other association. We're meeting on our own terms for our own reasons. All activities are voluntary. Again, the sense of agency. And a GREN must be recognized as a GREN by its members. Can't just be a group of friends. And you have to have active participation by members. So just giving you a quick rundown of some of the descriptive characteristics of these groups. I'll highlight a couple. First is that 85% are formed with neighbors. And when I say neighbors, I mean like a very small neighborhood block. So a lot of the argument that I'm going to make today is tied to the way that Bamako's neighborhoods are still pretty ethnically and socioeconomically diverse. Sometimes due to lack of city planning, but also because we still have compound structures where families can welcome relatives from rural areas to come live with them. So a bunch of different people, they form on neighborhood blocks. Only 53% have an ethnic group that makes up over half. So very ethnically diverse. And just to give you a sense of sort of their openness, so we're conducting this research in 2014, roughly 2 years after the start of the conflict. There were at least 300,000 displaced persons at that time, and 14% of the groups that we talked to had already absorbed displaced persons as members. It's quite interesting. 33% of groups had members from the north of the country, which is important at the time because that's a very salient political cleavage in terms of people debating whether this area of Azawad should have political independence. Now, we can talk a lot about this, but the big caveat, I should say, is that 56% of the groups that we talked to are only men and 78% are mostly men. So while there are some mixed gender spaces, I have to be very careful in any like broad generalizations I'm going to draw because really we're talking about urban male populations for the most part, right? So these aren't just political discussion groups. They engage in positive norms of reciprocity. 88% of the groups provide financial help. 41% have financial services. This is, I guess, Granovetter would totally anticipate that given the diverse ties within the group, 72% of folks are able to find jobs or economic opportunities. And this is somewhat interesting in that the stereotype of Gren in Mali, at least, if you think about soap operas or the way they're characterized on TV, is often that it's a group of lazy, underemployed graduates hanging out, talking about girls and cars when they should be looking for jobs. Well, actually, it's a pretty good place to look for potential opportunities. They meet very often. 75% have daily meetings. That doesn't mean all members are going all the time. And what's really interesting, 71% of the groups participate in public goods provision. The most popular form of public goods provision is cleaning open sewers, which is really important in terms of malaria prevention. Okay, so I already sort of highlighted or forecasted this, but I think these groups are really theoretically interesting because they are so diverse. So you have a chance to have conversations between people who have sources of information from really different parts of the country. They're spending face-to-face time in these groups. If you think, at least, if I think about the current state of American political discourse among citizens, like it's on X or Facebook, and no one's talking to each other face-to-face. They're building on this culture of deliberation and debate. People are discussing public problems. And as I'll say in a second, drawing on sort of the Malian political culture more broadly, there are de-escalation mechanisms that are really important. So unlike a lot of consensus-based sort of discussion where the goal of discussion is to get to a common answer, these types of groups invite, devil's advocates and alternative viewpoints. So contentious debate is very much a part of what they are, but you have to leave as friends. And so there's that level of political socialization that I think is really important. And then finally, these groups are engaging in public goods provision the way a lot of scholars of social capital would want groups to be thinking sort of more publicly about the civic form. Okay, 10 minutes. So in our household survey, we know that in Mali, 60% of men are members of these groups. So they're not trivial. 24% of men are women. Women's rate of participation is slightly higher in regional capitals than in Bamako, the capital city. And so what do we find when we compare members and non-members? We find that members are more knowledgeable about current events and politics than non-members, although this drops out a bit when we include controls. But even so, we know that this is a place where people are generally more knowledgeable. They're going to be talking about politics. This is really interesting because this runs counter to sort of Putnam's like 1993 ideas, or Putnam more broadly, that members of these groups, even though they're actively engaged, I'm going to make this argument, they're deliberating, they are providing neighborhood goods, they're not any more likely to engage in formal politics. So we don't see the links to formal institutions. I want to convince you all that we should still really care about them, but this is important to sort of stress the separation between formal groups, or formal politics, and activities of good. Members report greater rates and trust of others in Malian society, but they don't have a greater rate of trust in the government than non-members. So that's sort of consistent here. And in general, if we look at the average member and non-member, members have higher levels of schooling, less likely to be heads of household, less likely to live in a spouse, more likely to have worked, less likely to have a job in the formal sector. All right. So now we're going to use the focus group data. These are 66 focus groups, about 1,000 participants, but only 330 people actively spoke. And we can talk about sort of what that means. And I think that's there's an interesting discussion to be had about focus group methodology and when you're working with organic groups, so groups that already know each other, how you think about sort of quantitative counts of anything and what sort of dissent looks like and what consensus looks like. All focus groups, or the vast majority, are conducted in Bambara, maybe a couple in Peul. So read this with that bias, that most of them are coming from the dominant language of the South, and then translated and transcribed into French. And so I had 2 research assistants listen to the recordings and then do these, and then I compared the transcripts so I could make sure I had intercoder reliability. The questionnaire was administered by 4 lead RAs, some of whom had been working with me for over 5 years at that point, so I had a lot of confidence. I attended the first 8, 9 sessions and then realized that my presence there was probably, it was hard to tell, honestly, but I felt very confident in their ability to work without me, so then I let the team sort of continue on. We can talk more about that choice in the Q&A. And so the guiding question of this module is, do Grão contribute to social cohesion, or can Grão divide people by creating solidarity between some, but creating social distance from others who are not members? And then we're going to try to trace the causal claims made by members. So I use this software out of University of Bath called Causal Map app. And sort of this shows you can't really see the words, but the idea of you're highlighting cause and consequence factors. So when people talk about a cause, you're highlighting that and it ends up showing up like this. And then when they talk about a consequence, you're mapping out like this. And sometimes there are intermediary steps. This happens, then this happens. But it's a neat way to think about causal claims in qualitative data. And so this is an example. What I've done here is I've filtered to say, give me the 9 most common. Remember, this is an open question. And we did prompt them to give sort of negative consequences. Give us the 9 most frequent impacts that people talked about when they talked about being members of focus groups. And just another sort of methodological note. What you don't have control over is how precise or how vague people are and what they say an outcome is, right? So we do have things like benefit society, but I don't know, like really what people mean there. Or another one, yeah, I guess the rest of these are more concrete. Some I came in with deductively. I was looking for whether they mentioned bridging or bonding, sort of, or how I was looking to code this as sort of in-group solidarity or outreach to other groups in society, a type of socialization into Malian political culture, public goods provision. This is related to peace and stability, psychological support. That was something I didn't look for. I'm a political scientist, so I'm naive, and I didn't realize like how important the psychological feeling, like a full citizen having agency in the space mattered. So psychological support, and then information and knowledge sharing. And so when I think about sort of what might drive civic engagement, we're going to look at some of the quotes related to information sharing and deliberation, but also socialization. And by socialization, I mean socialization into these pro-social Malian norms of sort of supporting community and putting community first, suppressing any kind of conflict. And then finally, public goods provision. And I'll quickly jump through these, but just to give you a sense of what people were talking about when they were talking about information sharing and deliberation. All in all, it must be noted that the GRAN is very important. We listen to each other, and generally we have ideas about life in general, such as information on services, national, international news. In the GRAN, there are no secrets, and it's very difficult that there are secrets in the GRAN concerning current events, information on such and such a thing. Okay, that's coming from Opti. Yeah, so here, this respondent, right, is talking about they can have access to different news. They're triangulating across news sources. And one of the reasons this is really important in the context of the study is at that time, there wasn't a lot of sort of local language deliberation about news and current events. Things have dramatically changed in the 10 years later, and that's much more frequent. But so if you came in and you only speak Bambara, you can sort of have access to something that might have been on RFE or another international news station. All right, that is to say, sometimes we can exchange among us young people about national topics. There are many things. We're sitting here. We exchange about daily life, the management of the country, politics, youth employment. There are many topics, but as the Bambara say, one person, one mind, several people, several minds. As long as you exchange with other people, you are by default kept informed of something that you didn't know about. The GRAN is important for all of these reasons. So here, this is giving a nod towards the fact that people are actively working together to sort of update their beliefs. There's some degree of sort of persuasion or triangulation happening. Okay, in the short amount of time left, just here are some examples of sort of social cohesion within the GRAN. And so this is a tricky question people often ask me. Is this happening? Is this just a byproduct of sort of Malian political culture, which I think that's partially true, but it's no doubt that these forums help young citizens sort of think about the ways in which they can contribute to social cohesion more broadly, right? And so when they're talking about schools to correct bad behavior, some of that bad behavior might be greedy or sort of individualist motivated behavior. And we can debate later what there are adverse consequences to that kind of counsel too. But it's very much, this is some of the mechanism that's related to sort of de-escalation in the context of conflict. All right, and then we have public goods provision. This is very straightforward. For example, we get together on a Sunday to weed the streets and unclog the pipes so that water can pass. All this is beneficial to the city. In addition, some can have their septic tank without a cover and children could fall in it. And to avoid this issue, we raise awareness among these people so they can cover their tank for the safety of the children. And here they're organizing broader events. So it's not just members, but it's broader community events for this day of sanitation. So scope conditions, like I'm thinking a lot about where places like this might exist, sort of multi-ethnic, socioeconomically diverse groups that are talking about the state of affairs in the country. And so this can only happen, right, if political regimes are allowing adequate freedom of association, freedom of organization. Malian government led by Assimi Goita currently ban political parties again. And I wonder, I would guess that today in Mali, the same types of conversations are not possible. They're definitely GRAN having conversations, but there are certain topics that would definitely be off limits. So thinking about a scope condition requirement, need of freedom of association, you need to be able to discuss public affairs. And then, yeah, no matter what claim I'm making today, we need to be wary of women's exclusion from some of these deliberative spaces, right? Yeah, great. So I'll conclude there, but I look forward to your feedback. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all our three panelists. We've had a rich and a broad array of points to see, I think, ranging from almost a discussion of ontological paradoxes of some of theoretical foundations of political regimes and political movements that either contest or support them. We've seen also how the emergence and effects of certain social movements and protests can affect authoritarian governance in Nigeria. And maybe in this last paper, how maybe we can think of the popular foundations, if we can say that, of civic attitudes and how they relate to forms of and political systems in countries of the global south. Where we'll open the floor for the debate. We're a bit, because we've started thanks to Bogota being Bogota, and now we've changed seasons now, as we do every day. Yeah, and summer will last for about 15 minutes. We'll open the floor. We'll take a bit less time maybe to be, because I think we have lunch at some point and we can't.
Like you said, we'll be half an hour for the coffee break.
Yeah,
we
so
can
let's-
go through the coffee break.
Exactly. Okay. So floor is open for questions, comments.
Thank you, Yusuf. Thank you to our panelists. I have a question for Philip and a question for Jamie, correct? So I'll start with Jamie, given your presentation is fresh in my head and so incredibly interesting, by the way. Is the government aware of Kren? I'm sure. Yes. So are they worried about the potential subversion that these, meetings can create? And again, you were very clear in saying, look, this does not translate usually to the normal political engagement that we would expect. But I'm sure that the authorities may keep an eye on what happens in Rennes. Do you have a sense that they have tried perhaps to infiltrate? I know it seems like just friends getting around some tea and chatting, but I don't know, maybe there's a new dude who comes over. Who are you? Yeah, I just want to join. Maybe that guy is from the government. So I don't know if you had a sense of that potentially going on. And as an aside, perhaps not so much of a question, that reminded me as well, and I'm glad Marine is here. She does Yemen, our colleague here, and it's like cut chewing in. Yeah, there's a within book, I guess, on the. So I thought about that parallel, just people, sitting around the table, and maybe in Italy would be just drinking wine, but that's another thing. And Philip, if I understand correctly, you were basically positing instead that we are witnessing perhaps the combination of two political, I don't want to say trends, but political phenomena, perhaps. One is vanguardism and the other is technocracy, right? And they may be converging into a new model of doing politics for which we do not have a name yet. And tell me if I got your point correct and where you think we can see already some instances of these, a combination of so-called two rivers of doing politics to an extent. But yes, that would be my questions.
Thank you. I think it's a good follow-up to Massimo's points for Jamie as well. I was curious if you could say a little bit more about the limits or not of the group, as in how does it, and there might be a variation here, but how does it happen? Does somebody just sit down in the group, or can anybody exclude or not? How do we set limits there? And it was just also trying to think a bit about the example you're talking about. How does that abstract to other similar spaces around the world? Is this just the local cafe my grandfather used to go to escape my grandmother and just, chat? Or is this different? How does it relate as well to a lot of spaces you have, particularly in the global south, of support and exchange, as in because you don't have the social net, so you have a kind of constant indebtedness between people, if that makes sense, of to be able to deal with the crises that you handle, which is different maybe in a context of having a social state. And then if we have time, I'd be really curious to understand a bit more around some of the gender dynamics and whether is there something about the masculine space that is important for that space itself and what that space does or not. And Philip, I'm unfamiliar with that particular area of research, so I'm just saying this as a caveat. I was a bit uncomfortable with your use of the term vanguard for the type of groups you describe. So that might just be me. For me, vanguardism is about being at the forefront. There's a kind of almost a progressive undertone to the idea, potentially or not. So I'm wondering how the terminology and the groups and the kind of ethno unity or racism or whatever that you describe in some of those groups actually works. I think another point was when you were saying about technocratic governments and that we haven't seen those, I was wondering if you've looked at all at international intervention, sort of, you know, UN running Kosovo, or the type of governance structure we've seen in Somalia, for instance, you know, MPs being paid by the UN, or, you know, even some of the things we might see in Yemen or other places, and whether those would be interesting comparisons.
Hi, thank you. Thank you so much for such a rich panel. Philip, same, this is the first time that I'm hearing this, so I guess my question comes from a place of ignorance, but I would love to hear more about how you're applying the theoretical tools that you're offering to explain what's going on with the Republican Party right now in the US. I heard you briefly mentioning the conflation between technocratic and identity politics to explain what's going on with the Democratic Party. But if you could use some of those tools to analyze what's going on with Trump, I will highly appreciate it. And then my other question is for Domilola. I do research in Arauca in an area that is heavily influenced by two different left-wing guerrilla groups. And the same as you described, I found that there are different ways of talking that bring these opposite groups together. And I would love to hear more about the concrete forms of language that are able to bring people from different ethnic groups and religion together and build this shared understanding of the state and the government. Thank you so much. I learned so much about Mali. I didn't know anything. Thank you.
Take one last, and then we'll let answer and have another round.
But one guys, so. Yeah.
Oh, no, I have a question later.
Okay.
I'll be quick. I have a question for Jamie, echoing the former one. Who decides who can be a member? And for Damilola, you were saying that the government was indifferent to the protests. And so I was wondering, in your research, do you find other ways that civil society can engage with the government? Like, who do they listen to, or what do they listen to?
And it will be very short. Are we obliged to use the terms that are completely irrelevant to the contexts? I mean, I'm talking about vanguardism. Vanguardism is very, as Sophie was saying, it's specific. Like, it has a meaning in it. And I know that you've conducted a lot of research on vanguardism, but I'm wondering if there's no other way of naming it, because people become vanguards for a thing, like they want to change something, and they are ready to, you know, give their lives for that, and for many other things. So I'm hearing quite a lot. For instance, many people use multitude of negri heart to explain something that are completely not related to. Some other people use Gramsci to talk about other things. But what I'm wondering is really like about the very origins, the ontology of it. Are we obliged to use these terms to explain the things that are not related?
Thank you, Ray Charles. So who wants to go first? Should we keep the question for the second round?
Yeah.
Okay. Would you like to ask? Amina?
Yeah, thank you very much. My observation from the protest that's been happening in Nigeria when it comes to the form of language that bring people together is a need. The agitation for good governance. For the youth, education became like a mirage. They could no longer afford even to go to school, because even being in school, for those who were in school, was extremely costly. And so the cost of living was too high. The cost of transportation, feeding, even for those who were in school, was a problem. And then for majority of the populace in town, fuel has gone from 400 to 1,000. It was like a sudden cost of living increased. And so it was no longer about if I was a Christian or I'm a Muslim. That was a common language that brought people together. So it was not your ethnic group. And everybody speaks English. In Nigeria, it's a common language, you speak English. So that was a mode of communication with the social media, because it was even at that point very risky for you to come out in some places. But people could organize using the social media. So that was a form of, so it was no longer, if it didn't matter if you're a Christian or a Muslim, if you're from the north or from the south, because a lot of people in the north even protested more. And because in the north, a lot of the younger people have been deprived of education. Their leaders over the years had deprived these people because of almajirism and the stuff in this part of the country from going to school, kind of. And because a lot of them didn't go to school. But these were the same youth that came out to protest during the end bad governance. And a lot of them. So there was a common language they spoke. And it was the need for the people. That was what brought them together, irrespective of your culture, irrespective of your language, irrespective of where you're from, of a religion. So that was the thing that brought them together. And basically, they used that mode to communicate. The social media was used to communicate the 10 demands the people had. And so they spread this using the social media, and that connected the people across the nation. I hope that explains that. And the question about who do the government listen to is difficult. Before, some years back, the civil society organization were very active. But for me, recent times, I think the present administration, the civil society organization tend to dance to the tune of the present administration. Because I remember then when there was a form of crisis when Goodluck Jonathan was in power, civil society organizations were the one coming out to protest. But right now, it seems that they are quiet, more like if the government had bought them. And so that is why the people, the young people, starting from the end SARS and this present protest, is more of the people themselves saying, enough is enough. We want to be able to go to school. Nigeria is not a poor country. It's just mismanagement, corruption, and lack of apathy for the people. Because a few people are just siphoning what the general populace should enjoy. And so that is what is happening. And so they didn't want to listen to the people. But then the people actually came out in this regard, especially with the end bad governance. And that's why some of the steps the government is presently taking to ensure they then came up with the money for there's this provision the government has made recently for those who are in school to collect loans so they can use it to pay for their educational bill. They actually came out with some, and there is actually, since I've been here, there's actually some bills, because presently they're actually asking for reform, the INEC reform in INEC. And because they feel that we cannot have any change in governance if we don't have a reform in the electoral process. And so this is as a result of some of these protests that has happened. So even though they didn't want to listen, they are trying to take steps to ensure that they turn things around. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks for everybody's questions. So starting with suppression. So in the end of 60s, 70s, the military regime at that time absolutely went after Grand. So there's a history of them sort of, and at the national conference in 1992, some prominent groups were actually invited. So I think the government to try to disband these groups, that would be probably a poor strategy, because they're so they mean so much to young people. But that said, I think you're absolutely right in terms of infiltration. I can't speak to that. Last time I was in Bamako was 2 years ago. And at that time, there's at a minimum a total concern about infiltration on two fronts, both from the government, in that right now in Mali, or I'd say it's changing a bit, but for a while there were good citizens that supported the junta and bad citizens who didn't, sort of in public discourse. So there's not as much space. You can talk about a lot of things, but you know where you go out of bounds. And I think especially in the Mopti area, concern with insurgent groups and what you say and whose cousin is affiliated with whom, because very fluid sort of movement of peoples. And so I think this space about what people are talking about, that space is constricted, and probably is more about like finding me a girlfriend or a future wife, or, you know, which is still very important. But I think that political, I don't know, there's been truncated political discussion. You can talk about certain political things, right? but not others. So in your question, I think there was a broader question about scope conditions. And I'd say something that's really important is the diversity of these groups. So something I'm interested in, if anybody has thoughts, other places where you get rich people, poor people, people from different regional homelands all together, because that's a critical component of the bridging part and the triangulating information. If somebody can say, well, my cousin said when she was taking the bus to Kidal, she saw X, Y, and Z, like that sort of personal narrative, right, can be a bit more persuasive than some kind of generalized news. But then it's coupled with, as you pointed out, this broad tradition of social reciprocity that is found in many groups in the global south, especially building that bonding. So you have this really interesting mix of like trust and solidarity between members, and yet this openness to, it's not just about this very defined core in-group, but sort of this broader notion of other connections. But I think the trick is, and this goes back to your question about language, is that Mali has this vocabulary of Sanankuya, this joking relationship between groups that was absolutely established as a cross-cutting cleavage that people draw on and is part of this discourse of a multi-ethnic polity. So that's always my question, is like, how much work is that doing and does it transfer? The question about remind me the question about gender, was it the limits? Oh, yes. Thank you. Yeah. So Julian Bondaz, who's an anthropologist, has written a lot about these as sites of masculinity. There's other great work, I think it's Matlock, on sort of consumption, right, as a form of practicing masculinity. Adeline Mascalier has done great work on Fada in Niger, which are very similar, and talks about these groups as a way to create structure to time when you're underemployed. So I think, yes, there's a broad tradition of talking about GREN as supports to underemployed young men who have tremendous sort of demands put on them. Mali is a very, like many places, in order to become an adult as a male, you need to provide for others. And so it's very stressful if you're underemployed. So this is also a place of reprieve from all of that, but a place to assert your masculinity. And female labor, bringing out food is in the background for a lot of this, not all groups, but most of them. And then who decides who can be members? So something that I thought was interesting and I wasn't expecting, over 80% of groups have a leader. Sometimes they're elected, sometimes it's the person who can pay for the tea. But even though there is that hierarchy, most decisions are made with the group. And so the groups are created, right, by a group of people in the neighborhood. So as people move to the neighborhood, and this is what we see with the IDPs, if they hang around enough, they might be then sort of invited to be an actual member. But there's a lot of fluidity. It's not uncommon for people to stop their car or motorbike and ask a GREN, hey, is the tea ready? And then come over and have a little bit of tea and then leave. So they're somewhat open, but they're also sites of intense intimacy. So there's a lot of levels, I guess, of membership. I don't know if that answers your question.
So I was thinking about the question about language. I needed to point out the fact that the protesters used English, Pidgin language, Hausa, Igbo, because they were able to connect with the people in their different locality. That is very, very important, and use it to communicate and mobilize people. And another thing was this use of these hashtags, like slogans. It actually played a very critical role in fostering that solidarity. For example, enough is enough, we are not slaves in our country, hardship is unbearable. All those became rallying cries for the people, cutting across these linguistic divides. Very, very important to talk. And that expression, that they use it to express their frustration, and it was universally understood by the people. I needed to point out that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for the questions. Start with Massimo first. Probably, so in thinking of examples, admittedly, that's where some of the research is hopefully going soon. With that sort of brief mention of something like woke capital or something of that type, some of the examples that have come up would be something like, say, Vanguard or BlackRock. An organization that's a private company, has exceptional influence on governmental affairs and so forth, but doesn't act necessarily in a way you would necessarily expect an organization that size to work. Technocratically, in terms of some of this organization, yes. In terms of what it's attempting to legitimate, or with ESG and so forth, what it's trying to push, seems honestly just kind of weird, compared to what you would expect for an organization of that type. A second might be, well, one that obviously caused quite a bit of debate in the US about a month or two ago, using a new organization like, say, USAID or something of that type as a example of, for lack of a better term, sort of like the cursus honorum that now goes through with people who might be personnel in these things. So, you know, if you're looking in the 1950s, what would be the cursus honorum? You spend some time in the military. Yes. Oh, yep. Sorry about that. So sort of course of honor of how you try and build up your career, say in the 1950s, you'd be doing it with, say, start in the military, maybe have some sort of like potentially blue collar job, work in get to the university, go to the right kind of university, work for the right kind of people. Now it might be go to an Ivy League school, start out at USAID, or start out at McKinley, or at PwC, or some other sort of group like this. Then maybe spend some time at Goldman Sachs and move to someplace else. This kind of issue of personnel seems to be where it might be coming in. That's at this point where it's still in the exploratory stages, to be honest. In terms of the Republican Party, now what's interesting with this is, and this is where Trump especially is kind of interesting in some ways. So if you're looking back to like, say, 2015, 2016 is when you start seeing a lot of more to a certain extent nation, to a certain extent race vanguardist language popping up significantly with people who might be supporting him in some ways. Which I won't lie, made that research really fun, that you'd be spending half your time reading Nietzsche and Evola and Schmidt, and the other half of the time you'd be looking at Pepe the Frog or Soy Jacks or other meme sort of things, because this is the way they'd be communicating amongst themselves. What seems to be happening in the Republican Party, though, and say sort of like the rightist movement in general in the United States, maybe more broadly, is sort of an internal dispute where Trump has probably the best way I could try and compare it would be, say, the more vanguardist elements are somewhat like the, say, Falangists dealing with Franco in Spain. They exist, they're trying to have more influence, but they're dealing with an authoritarian who is not necessarily inclined towards connecting them to the larger part of the organization. He's happy to have them for mobilization, but not necessarily more organizationally, which, I mean, for the vanguardists, that's bad luck for them. Good for us because it makes things less bad. Now, would that change potentially? So let's say, for instance, let's say some of the trade policies that the Trump administration is going under right now take a pretty bad turn, start a recession, something of that type. The economic elements inside the Republican Party might be weakened at that point, and that might give more strength for some of these more race or nation vanguardist types of individuals or groups to have more influence. It mostly depends on whether or not Trump is weakened, that he needs to rely on them. Since he's been at a comparatively strong point right now, he hasn't had to. He seems to be happy to have them as allies, but doesn't seem to really want to give them much in the way of influence within the administration by giving them positions or so forth. But that could change potentially. Whether it would, I mean, I hope not, but potentially it could, again, if a major economic downturn or some other sort of legitimation crisis might happen for the administration, would be my estimate. Sort of long story short, especially earlier on when he was first coming out to the scene, they seem to have much more potential to be much more active. As years have gone on, it seems they've been very loud, but less able to influence actual policies than would be preferable for their purposes. But again, that might change. Actual use of the term vanguardism itself, I admit, that is a question that has come up in the past as well. I guess probably the first way I would kind of answer it is one of the reasons for using it is just in terms of certain structural similarities you see between these kind of organizations, that both organizationally and in terms of their sort of ideological infrastructure, they seem to have similarities. Yeah. Oh, sorry about that. They, oh, sorry about that. Dreadfully sorry about that. So if they, in terms of like the ideological and organizational infrastructure of these groups, even though they obviously loathed each other, they're similar enough that it seems there's still a point to try and see how they're sort of taxonomically related to one another. But I suspect part of it also is the issue that comes in with, yeah, the word itself. So if we look to say while researching vanguardism, something I hadn't anticipated was looking at some of the debates that occurred in the early 1970s, specifically about the word revolution. Because the idea for much of the discussion from going around 1930s until about the 1970s, looking at what was being referenced, the question was, were the fascists and the Nazis revolutionary? And that frequently the idea was, well, no, because revolution is good. And obviously fascists and Nazis aren't. So even though they wanted to radically change the society, radically change all of these things, do everything that sounds really revolutionary, but they couldn't really be revolutionary, could they? Starting in the early 70s, you start seeing some scholars saying, well, we're just talking about revolution. Revolution is a thing. Whether it's good or bad, we're leaving to decide. We just want to concern ourselves with the phenomenon. Could be good, could be bad. To an extent, I'm doing the same thing with vanguardism. Could it potentially be good? I mean, admittedly, I'm biased. I generally don't find it to be oftentimes, but it potentially could be. But especially to this idea of it being sort of progressive to the forefront, admittedly, for almost all of them, at least in terms of their own self-perception, they tend to view themselves this way. Even if you look at, say, the Nazis themselves, sort of the example of the worst of the worst, they honest to God thought that they were progressing humanity to a higher level of its development, a higher level of evolution, that they were making the world a better place. Now, obviously that's bat guano insane, but is how they were thinking. And the way that these sort of organizations are structured, again, whether it's on class or race or nation or religion or oppression or what other sort of groups may come in, that I'm mostly just trying to look at it as a phenomenon itself. Is it good or bad? I almost feel like I'm now going to be quoting that rocket scientist again. Whether it's good or bad is a political question. I'm just the research part of it, but yeah, effectively looking, for better or for worse, trying to look at it regardless of whether it would be something positive or negative, just as a phenomenon itself.
Hello? No? Hello. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the second panel of the day on national and transnational mobilization. So we're going to start. We have three speakers. So we have Neil Ketchley from the University of Oxford, who will be speaking on the diffusion of anti-BDS legislation across US state legislatures. We also have Monica Espinosa from here, Universidad de los Andes, who will be talking on the dilemmas of recognition in Colombia, democracy against the grain and indigenous pueblos, and Camille Byrne from Leipzig University, who will be speaking on election management by the African Union, practices of the AU Panel of the Wise. Okay, we're going to go in order, so I'll hand over to Neil.
Well, good morning. It's good to see this very lively group. Thank you for the invitation. I am an anthropologist, so it's going to be quite a change here in terms of my case and what I want to talk about. I am going to refer to what I call the dilemmas of recognition in Colombia, democracy against the grain and indigenous pueblos. I couldn't, I saw a lot of relations to Jamie's presentation on Mali. There are many things about civic engagement here. Of course, I had this question about cousinage. It's very common in African societies to have different kinds of alliances, what we call consanguine and, different kind of alliances. So I was very drawn to that and to the kind of social relations and kinship relations that you can see there. So hopefully this makes sense. I am going to structure my talk around questions. You are going to see some images that come from my research. The first question is, what is democracy against the grain? And I really appreciate Patrick's talk about democracy and all the things that he was thinking about. Why deploy this concept to approach indigenous politics in Southwest Andes? And what does it tell us about recognition? So this is the region in Colombia. It's a very important region, a central one. We call it Southwest Andes region. And so what is democracy against the grain? You can see there some pictures of the movement, the indigenous social movement I have been researching. So I am going to try to answer with different ideas to this important question. First of all, this is a decolonizing project that has been in place since the late 90s and begins with my anthropological research, and I use ethnography, oral history, historical research of primary sources of Manuel Quintín Lames' Indian thought and social movement in Cauca, Huila, and Tolima during the 20th century. One can have two stages. The one that is called Quintinada from 1910 to 1921, and De la Mismo in south of Tolima from 1922 to 1967. And the project is also a reaction against the confinement of indigenous politics to the controversial ideas of non-modern primitivism, essentialism, and elopement into culturalism. It is a reaction against systematic depoliticization of indigenous politics and the neoliberal push towards culturally differentiated frames, boxes that foster non-recognition. It is a call to walk along with indigenous pueblos as political communities, actively engage with democracy, and to value their intense history of grassroots democratization. I am here very influenced by Bangkok's research on radical democracy in the Andes. The project studies the emergence of Indianness in Southwest Andes as an identity and as a political resource during the 20th century, the overlap with the discourse of ethnicity in the context of state multiculturalism since the 90s, the contrast between recognition and recognition, and the role of neoliberal rationality and governance in stagnating or even destroying democracy. What is it democracy? What is democracy against the grain? So what you see here is something that is very important, and one only learns about that by participating in that. NASA people call it the multitude with one voice. And it comes in this way. The indigenous pueblos' demotic way of being is a combination of what they call comunitariedad, collectivism, and also struggles for the common. Democracy as practice, I am following Sheldon Walling's concept. I studied in UMass with a pupil, I don't know if you say like that, Nick Senos. He recently died, but he was a student of Sheldon Walling. Sheldon Walling says democracy is a project concerned with the political potentialities of ordinary citizens, that is, with their possibilities for becoming political beings through the self-discovery of common concerns and modes of action for realizing them. And I also bring to this idea the common as an instituent praxis, Laval and Dardot's understanding of the common as a political principle that characterizes social struggles against neoliberal rationality and governance. The common is the experimental act of creating rules and forms of self-government through collective practice, independent of existing laws, and even actively working against them. Democracy's relationship to memory. Collective memory is a lived territorial and embodied practice among Southwest Andes indigenous pueblos. Resistance struggles are the common substance of being Indian and being Nasa, Misak, or Pijao. So, what is democracy against the grain? Third. And here I am going to talk about the democracy against the grain. Already I talk about that. All orthodox conceptions of politics that erase the political as they erase indigenous people's political agency and legacies. 20th century indigenous political ideas are born out of intercultural and communitarian practices, forms of historical consciousness, and philosophies of nature. Greater right, for instance, it is called Derecho Mayor, Ley de Origen, mandates collective principle, for example, the NASA notion of our permanence, and the life plans following cosmological principles, for instance, the Misak notion of time, space that is related to history. Approaching indigenous pueblos' conceptions of authority and authority as exerted by virtuous example and from the heart. Understanding the power of the word, thinking, putting into action, making, saying, and the connection with cosmology and sacred geography. Approaching assemblies and the political momentum of the multitude with one voice. This is very interesting process. And in blue, I am working on this. I mean, I have been working on this for 3 decades, more or less. But now, well, I am like emphasizing these recent ideas, following the ways of the Minga, which is a collective organizing turned into action, walking as a multitude and acting together. Some people call it the force of people, la fuerza de la gente. Approaching situated understandings of the indigenous guard as a means of reframing resistance and defending a position of active neutrality during the armed conflict and escaping victimizing hegemonic narratives, resetting the political. Analyzing internal challenges of leadership, for instance, political activists and spiritual authorities, and the complexity of what Rappaport calls intercultural utopias. That is a method for appropriating external ideas from the point of view of the indigenous pueblos, connecting the diverse network of activists and creating a common sphere of action and an utopian political philosophy aimed at achieving interethnic cross-cultural dialogues. Finally, approaching coalitions in electoral politics and participation in wider forms of popular politics. Why deploy democracy against the grain to approach indigenous politics, to rearticulate the political and the social? Sheldon Walling's ideas, he says the demos agency gives rise to the political by promoting the care of commonality. The people is not a pre-existent and continuous entity. Actors become political actors through their engagement, self-discovery of communal concerns, and participation in public deliberation about matters that affect their daily lives. Democracy is a mode of being conditioned by bitter experience, doomed to succeed only temporarily. However, it is the recurrent possibility as long as the memory of the political survives. Democracy is a political moment, perhaps the political moment, when the political is remembered and recreated. Democracy and memory, the relationship is very important in my research, remembering, recreating, and fostering the democratic spirit. Nonetheless, the idea that the political represents the idea that a free society composed of diversities can nonetheless enjoy moments of commonality when through public deliberations, collective power is used to promote or protect the well-being of the collectivity. Wendy Brown expands Walling's remarks on the political in her book about the ruins of neoliberalism. Democracy requires a robust cultivation of society at the place where we experience and a linked fate across our differences and separateness. The socialists were citizens of vastly unequal backgrounds and resources are potentially brought together and thought together. So what does it tell us about recognition? It tells us about the problem of difference, and I am talking about Colombia, within a society shaped by multi-layer, multi-scalar, and long-term dynamics of order and violence. Recognition reduces differences to interest and emphasizes the role of a grantor who habitually segregates difference from reciprocity. Inclusion is not guarantee of recognition. These are words, again, Walling's words. The American Indian nations have long been recognized, but recognition has meant genocide, neglect, and exclusion. Recognition implies concessions in the impregnability of identity. It is a two-sided situation. A radical revision in the culturally produced representations of a familiar being and integral notions of membership. Sometimes Walling even appeals to theological ideas like koinonia, or ideas that imply other kind of incorporation. So, to end, concluding remarks, the undemocratic wave of stigmatization and simplification of indigenous politics vis-a-vis Southwest Andes indigenous social movements' success in fostering the democratic spirit. And they are very, they really create coalitions and are sustaining a popular politics. The limits of a recognition amidst structural injustices, long-term exclusion, and the selective rejection of difference. These are based the findings of the Colombian Truth Commission regarding ethnic pueblos are directly related to structural racism, inequality. Colombia is the third and most unequal countries in the world. And I am just putting this, I am thinking about this recently, the idea, Wendy Brown's idea of neoliberalism, dismantling of society. Brown's insistence that the social is the foundation of democracy. And I was thinking about your presentation and these hierarchies, these ways of lobbying for these very anti-democratic laws and regulations. What is going on with the society? What is going on with social relations? So she talks about the social as the foundation of democracy and the importance of equality, and it comes the concept of isonomia to any concept and practice of democratic politics. Social justice is therefore important to generating and protecting democratic practices, institutions, and democratic imaginary. So I think how much the indigenous pueblo have contributed to this imaginary and how much we are still neglecting that contribution.
Wonderful, thank you so much. I'll pass on now to Camille.
Sorry.
Can I put any out to put my presentation? I'm gonna do another cut. Sorry, thank you. I'm gonna do another thematic cut. Maybe to start with a caveat, I'm not a political scientist, so I hope you bear with me with my presentation, and I'm a PhD student, so I'm finalizing my thesis, so be nice. Yeah, so I'm conducting a PhD on the African Union Panel of the Wise. And so I will do my best today to present the institution to you, then walk you through my frameworks, and then talk about the practices of the Panel of the Wise and, in a wider sense, the African Union in election management. All right. The Panel of the Wise that was developed in the transition process from the Organization of African Unity, which was founded in 1963 to combat colonialism and apartheid on the African continent, into the African Union, which was established in 2002. One of the first steps that the heads of state and government took in developing the African Union was to come up with an African peace and security architecture, making peace and security really at the core of the continental body's actions. The Peace and Security Protocol of the AU founded the Peace and Security Council, which is basically the main decision-making organ of the institution, and pillars that are supporting the PSC. You have the African Standby Force, which is its operational arm. It's made up of contingents of member states, so armed forces. You have the Continental Early Warning System, which is tasked with data collection and analysis to prevent conflicts. You have the Peace Fund, which supposedly funds all of these operations. And then you have the Panel of the Wise, which is kind of an institution of the Pan-African and indigenous idea of elders resolving conflicts. So what is the panel? It was the last pillar to be institutionalized from the architecture. They had their inaugural meeting in 2007, and their mandate is basically they can do whatever they want and whenever they can to prevent conflicts. So they're very flexible in advising and supporting the other pillars that I just talked about. They can pronounce themselves and act, as I said, whenever deemed necessary. They are 5 highly respected African personalities from various segments of society who have made outstanding contribution to the cause of peace, security, and development on the continent. They're appointed for 3 years with the possibility to renew the mandate once, and they're not paid. They're not based at the headquarters of the African Union, so they're based in their member states, and then they're called upon to act or can act themselves, theoretically. To give you an example, I'm going to just present quickly the 5th Panel of the Wise, which was active until a couple of months ago. So you have a professor, Babacar Kanté from Senegal, who is a professor of constitutional law, representing Western Africa. So it's 5 members because the African Union thinks of the continent in 5 regions. So each person represents a whole region, which is a whole problematic in itself. You have Phumzile Mlambo-Ntsuka, who is the former deputy president of South Africa and former secretary general of UN Women. You have Amr Moussa from Egypt, the former secretary general of the Arab League. Domitian Diazia, Ndiaye, the former president of Burundi, and Effie Owour. She was the first female high court judge in Kenya. As I said, it's not active anymore because there was the assembly of the AU in February. And so the three on this side, so the Eastern, Central, and Southern African one were reappointed, but the other two regions still have to come up with their candidates or their panelists. All right, so what am I doing in my thesis? There are not many publications about the AU panel of the whites. It's not a very known institution. And the few there are, they focus on what is not working, the lacking resources, what they should be doing or what they're not doing. So there's a lot of criticism, and some have even questioned whether the panel should exist in the first place. At the AU, of course, the perception is very different. People work with the panelists and they, of course, are convinced that the institution has a role to play and is efficient. So just to give you an example, they are now more and more popular on the X account of the Political Affairs, Peace and Security Department. For example, when they're on a solidarity mission to South Sudan, so the African Union is trying to show we are doing something. And they're increasingly engaging in election observation missions, which I'm going to talk more about in this presentation. All right, so what am I doing? I'm part of a research project called African Non-Military Conflict Intervention Practices based in Leipzig. And basically the assumption of our project is to say that there are institutions on the African continent, mainly the African Union and regional economic communities, that are engaging in non-military interventions, but they are not talked about in the literature. So we have empirical projects like myself looking at specific institutions. And then I have two colleagues in Leipzig, Elisabeth Wank and Vincent Schober, who are building a database basically to show what the African Union is doing. And our theoretical framework to do that is practice theory. So practice theory in international relations has been coined by Emmanuel Adler and Vincent Pouliot, both based in Canada. And this is the definition that they came up with and that I'm using in my thesis. So international practices are socially meaningful patterns of action, which in being performed more or less competently, simultaneously embody, act out, and possibly reify background knowledge and discourse in and on the material world. So it's a constructivist framework. In my own words, I would say it's the assumption that you have to look at the micro to understand the macro. And so practices, in my understanding, are ways of doing things. For example, in an institution, I'm looking at specific actions that will lead to strategies, policies, or that will legitimize the institution and what they're doing. I highlighted in the definition what I'm concerned with. So practices are patterned, they're performed repeatedly, and they entail background knowledge and an understanding of why these practices are performed. Yeah, just a quick overview. Practice theory has been used, for example, by Séverino Tesser to look at peace building, or to deconstruct the concepts like power or norms, or in articles looking at the UN, for example, on the left. So basically my question is, what are the practices of the African Union panel of the wise? I'm not looking at whether they work or not. I just want to take a step back and see what are they doing. So in order to find that out, I have conducted interviews using a method coined by the late sociologist Lee and Fuji, which is called relational interviewing. So the idea is that you reflect on interviewing as a process. You are conscious of your own bias. If you can, you go back to your interviewees to make sure that you understood correctly what they wanted to tell you. And I reflect on my positionality as a white European woman working on an institution that was founded to combat colonialism. I conducted 60 interviews with members of the panel, with people at the African Union, and with partners of the institution between October 2022 and March 2025. Yeah, so I was privileged to travel to Addis Ababa, to Ethiopia 3 times at this point. And of course, I'm analyzing a lot of official documents. This tells me a lot about their practices as well. All right, so talking about election management by the African Union. The African Union adopted the African Charter on Democracy, Elections and Governments in 2007, and they have a division of democracy, elections and constitutionalism, basically in charge with implementing that charter. So staff at the AU is supporting member states in the institutionalization of electoral democracy, making sure that inclusive elections are held, that voter registration can go forward according to constitutional rules. They're doing that by sending technical teams to member states, and they're holding election observation missions, and they are sanctioning member states where an unconstitutional change of government took place. So at the moment, there's a growing list, unfortunately. Where does the AU panel of the wise come in? So the practices that I'm talking about do not only relate to election management, but I'm going to try to exemplify them in that domain. One of the first decisions that the AU panel of the wise came up with, so you have to imagine that they have this wide mandate that they can do and say whatever they want, but they don't really know what to do. So the first members of the first panel came up with the idea of thematic reflections. So they decided to agree on a topic that they will think about, reflect upon every year to address issues that the rest of the African Union is not concerned enough about. So a challenge on the continent at that moment that they want to generate knowledge upon. So the first annual thematic reflection they decided on was on electoral related violence. This happened, so I'm tracing back how this came about. So in Kenya in 2007, on the 27th of December, elections were held. They led to violent protests, all candidates disputing the official results. And so the Assembly of Heads of State spoke out against, or called for de-escalation of the violent protests in Kenya. And then, as you can see here, the Peace and Security also spoke out twice about the situation and asked for a reflection about, what did they say? Electoral violence, I think. Yeah, violence occurring in electoral processes in Africa. And so basically the panel of the wise took that up. When I say the panel of the wise, it's most probably the person working for the secretariat of the panel of the wise working at the AU, following these developments and then saying, hey, it would be a good idea to reflect on electoral related violence in Africa. And so the panel of the wise had a meeting in July 2008 and decided to make that topic their annual thematic reflection. So once the members agree on the thematic reflection, what does it mean? They're eminent personalities, so they're unfortunately, that's what I thought when I started my research. They're not the ones drafting the report, obviously. They hire experts and consultants, and these write up the report, and then it becomes a panel of the wise report because the members get the draft, read it, give feedback, and then the authors go back to the draft, and that's what makes it a panel of the wise report. These thematic reflections have not become annual, so the first panel was pretty strict in having these annual reflections, but in total, and I mean, this was in 2008, now we are in 2025, and there have been 5 thematic annual reflections of the panel so far. What is specific about that report is that it was accepted by the Assembly of Heads of State in July 2009, which means that there was the order, so to say, from the heads of state to make this into policy at the African Union. It was also then published, which is also good for my work because only 3 out of the 5 reports are publicly available, actually. In the report, the authors adopted a holistic view of election management. So they don't just look at election observation, what the African Union can do, but they start with the drafting of the constitution, with civic education, then they go on to voter registration, the financing of political campaigns, the elections itself. And then at the end of the circle that you can see on the left, they go through a post-elections phase where audits and evaluations should be held and, if necessary, legal reform. The Assembly, as I said, adopted it and asked the then Department of Political Affairs to take the recommendations of the report and put them into AU policy. So some recommendations were included in the long-term election observation methodology of the African Union. What I'm interested in is to look at what this meant for further practices of the panel. So this led to the inclusion of the panel of the wise into election observation at the African Union. So since then, they have engaged in election observation missions, and this has skyrocketed in the past years, where panel of the wise members are almost included in every election observation mission of the African Union. I conceptualize election observation missions as visits, and these depend on other organs of the African Union. So the panel, even though they have the mandate to do whatever they want, as they're not paid, as they are sitting, let's say, in Namibia and elections are held in Egypt, they are dependent on the African Union on the headquarters to give them a mandate to be deployed on an election observation mission. So the current Commissioner for Peace and Security, for Political Affairs, Peace and Security is keen to involve the panel. So based on the recommendations that the panel made themselves, they are deployed when the continental early warning system that I talked about at the beginning assumes that the context is prone to violence. And then you will have an election observation mission. When it's really tense, they deploy a pre-election assessment. This can also be high-level panel members. And then you have a pretty technical election observation mission with short-term observers, making sure that the elections go well. And then on top of it, the AU would deploy a preventive diplomacy visit, which would be headed by a member of the panel of the WISE. And so the idea is that you have high-level elders that are part of the AU delegation, and that if after the results are published, candidates are disputing it and say, I won, no, I won, that you have a former president, a former vice president that can knock at their door and say, hey, let's try to de-escalate the situation. That's basically the idea of that practice of sending the panel of the WISE. So just to give you an example, these are elections between July 2023 and June 2024, and all of the arrows point towards countries where the panel of the WISE was deployed. So you have, for example, elections in Zimbabwe in August 2023. Well, actually, we already mentioned him today. Goodluck Jonathan, the former president of Nigeria, led the election observation mission. And then Ndiaziye, the member of the panel, was deployed on top to lead the preventive diplomacy mission. Or you have other elections where the panel of the WISE member is leading the election observation and the preventive diplomacy mission. All right, just to give you a full overview, the other practices I'm looking at are meetings and pronouncements. And what I want to just end with is the creation of subsidiary mechanism. So the panel of the WISE are just 5 people, but they have institutionalized inclusion in a way into this peace and security architecture that I started with. So they founded, I'm just going to focus on the Network of Women in Conflict Prevention and Mediation, FemWise Africa, and WISE Youth. So this is basically the inclusion of women and youth, which has been repeatedly criticized that they do not have enough enough space at the African Union. So basically the panel of the WISE and their support staff at the African Union have come up with these subsidiary mechanisms with a network of women in mediation and youth in conflict prevention and mediation. And now at every election observation mission, you also have members of these networks accompanying the panel members and the technical teams. All right, I hope I have succeeded in giving you an overview of the panel of the WISE and why it can be useful to look at their practices. As I said, the aim of my work is not to assess whether the panel of the WISE is an effective institution. From my perspective as a scholar in conflict resolution, I find it difficult because their job is to prevent conflicts. So when nothing happens, no one says anything, but if something happens, then everyone complains, but you do not know when they have done their job, basically. So yeah, based on, what am I saying? I see my research as a starting point of trying to understand how the panel works, and then I hope that other maybe political scientists will take it up and see if it's an effective mechanism or not. Thank you very much for your attention.
Great, thank you, Camille. I invite the speakers to come back. We have about 20 minutes for questions. I'll take a round of questions first. Right.
Thank you very much. I think I was having many thoughts on many points raised, but I will keep short and ask 2 questions. One of them is for Neil, because I mean, I have been following and observing the same thing back in the days when I was in Brussels working for Kurdish diplomacy, etc., before starting even my PhD. And I was observing the same thing, and we have been framing this as anti-democratic because basically it was, you know, the comes and goes between European Commission and Turkey, the Turkish government, and they have been basically doing the same thing and then showing it as a form of democracy. You know, and then comes the question of what democracy is really actually. You know, we have, I mean, I know it's too broad to answer in any ways, but I have been thinking about representative democracy and its flaws, like why it doesn't function actually in real terms. So my question to you, could you make some conclusions about liberal representative democracy in that sense? Because I think you did a great presentation, but I think there is more to say about that. And it would relate, I mean, it would clarify many other things for me as well. And the second question is for Monica. And it goes in the same direction. So I've been working in, you know, decolonialidad for I don't know, for like 7-8 years, and I have been following all those like all the terms and conceptual frameworks that they have been using, and but yeah, the contradictions or the relationship, not contradictions, but the relationship between recognition and representativeness, and especially in liberal democracy. We're talking about, and this goes something in between, especially in terms of inclusion of the or hearing the voice of indigenous peoples. It becomes something like, okay, let's include them, but we shouldn't hear them much. Okay, let's include them. That's important because we need to show our, you know, the consciousness of I would say humanity, or the consciousness of some people who think about that. At least we have something to say. Okay, we included indigenous people, but we don't need to do much. So I felt, I sensed a contradiction in your presentation, that you were praising sort of liberal representative democracy, and you were talking about the recognition. So I would ask you, could you please make your point a little bit clearer, because these are the things that usually go one against the other and not one providing space for the other. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Three great presentations. Really enjoyed them. I'll go in the reverse order. I had a quick question for all of you. So first with Camille. I think it's a really interesting topic. Looking forward to seeing the finished PhD. I was just thinking about your usage of practices, and I was wondering whether you also go back to some of the ideas underpinning, you know, practice theory, that are, a lot of them are inspired by Bourdieu's ideas around habitus or field. Do you see the panel of the wise as a field or not? Do you use any of those concepts? And I'm wondering about that because I'm wondering if in your analysis, well, you clearly state at the end that you're not interested in necessarily the effectiveness or not, but I'd be interested in understanding more the kind of why and what happens within it. So, for instance, are these about these individuals, being wise? What is it about being wise? And how much do they also change in the process of participating or being labeled as wise? And how much is it about personas and people? How much is it institutionalized? You were showing the shift, you know, over time of who constitutes it. So does that have an impact? So that side of things, be really interested in hearing more. Monica, great, really interesting presentation as well. And I was wondering, actually, going to your last point around the really important contribution of the indigenous groups to the quality of the democracy in Colombia or not. And it's a contentious topic, obviously, as Jeanne was highlighting. But I was wondering if you could take us back maybe to the 1991 constitution in Colombia, because maybe a lot of people, I think, who are foreigners were not going to be familiar with that, but how essential actually the Quintil de Mobilization and all of that played a role in that. And if not in the practices or what actually happened, but definitely at a much more legislative and constitutional level, I think is important. I don't know if there's a link to make. And then briefly, Neil, I thought that was just a really excellent paper, really exciting as well. And I'm wondering, I mean, these are 2 points that are not necessarily, you know, about the mechanics of the paper, but the wider context. One is, you know, the recent Heritage report that came out that showed the groups that have been very active on lobbying, especially on campus initiatives. And what was interesting there was that the identity of these groups were much more Christian affiliated groups. And I was wondering, in thinking back on the BDH legislation and the who's who, whether there is or not a link, or is that an evolution of action and that sort of thing? And linked to that was going back to the beginning of your presentation, when you really effectively showed how there was a pushback, right, against the boycott when it came to civil rights boycotts. So where is the possibility of pushback here or not? Why did the pushback not happen? It might not be in the scope of the paper, but I was just thinking about it more broadly. Thank you so much.
Okay, maybe a final question.
The Okay, I will be quick. Thank you all for your great presentations. Camille, I would love to hear more about sanctions. That isn't clear to me yet. And then, as I heard you talking about practice, I wonder if the notion of policy as practice from Levinson and Sutton could be helpful for you. I mean, it comes from anthropology. I'm guessing you come from IR, but maybe that could be, do you? Where are you situated? Okay, so maybe coming from anthropology of policy and policy as practice, I mean, could be helpful avenues. I don't know. Then Monica, thank you for your presentation. And along the same lines, I can't remember his name. Jan, thank you. I would love to hear more about how you unpack the contradiction between this notion of indigenous democracy and the contradiction of trying to decolonize democracy, if I understood you correctly, by bringing also authors who are very far away from the concrete realities that you're analyzing. So if you could unpack that a little bit. And then Neil, this is my political self. This is not my, oh, let me put it this way. What are you planning to do with this? Right? I live in Wisconsin, Madison, and I could see how this will just crush institutions. So are you planning just to publish it in an academic journal? Are you planning to reach out to The Intercept or Jacobin to put it out there? I mean, I just want to, yeah, hear more about the life that this paper is going to have. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for 3 great presentations, but I only have like a couple of questions for Neil. I think it's very interesting to see how this paper can not only talk about the quality of democracy and the backlash that we have been seeing over the past decade, I think, but also how policies can travel not only between districts or municipalities, but also between states. I think this is fantastic. But I have like 3 questions. The first one is when you presented the data, like you are planning on using 388 emails. That's the data that you have. But thinking about a period of 12 years, I think it might be like, I don't know, like 1 email every 10 or 11 days. So I think that might explain a little bit the connection, but I think it would be very interesting to see if there are like peaks on this email that correspond, something that came to my mind, that is my second question, if they correspond to the Black Lives Matters movement after 2020. If you can see, because I know there is amazing data, very granular in the US, and how to connect, like maybe what is the activity of social movements at district level or on the hexagons that you were representing the state, and if that level at the end increased or sparked maybe a rise on the emails asking like, hey, we don't know what to do when people is mobilizing. Do you have any idea on how to control it? And then this think tank is like, yes, we can provide this prohibition of the boycott repertoire. So thank you.
Thanks. All excellent papers. I just want to ask Kami, super interesting. And I was wondering, so I think you were saying that their initial analysis for recommendations was based on the 2007 Kenyan election, and the Kenyan government's made monumental sort of changes in response to that election. I was wondering, could you speak a bit to how the panel of elders is similar, or panel of the wise is similar or different to sort of both practices and prescriptions from the Kenyan government, but also like the EU or the Carter Center? I'm just curious, like where there's similarities or differences in terms of the way they processed these events, but then also what their recommendations are.
Okay, right. Should we start with Neil?
Yeah, thanks. So yeah, a lot to engage with here. So let me say, yeah, like I think we know the existence and the substance of liberal democracy by the efforts that the Israeli state goes to try to subvert them. So I think it's pretty clear and uncontroversial that after the Second Intifada, Israeli state policy can just not be reconciled with the norms of liberal democratic politics, both in terms of voter preferences that we know from survey data, but also politician preferences as well. And so in response to that, I think that over the last 2 decades, the Israeli state has sponsored through its Strategic Affairs Ministry and through other actors, really concerted and calibrated policies to try to subvert precisely these norms and institutions and rules. And I would say that I would go a little bit further than that. I was really recently influenced by there's a Egyptian-Canadian writer called Omar al-Aked, who's written this beautiful book. It has the best title. It's called One Day Everyone Will Have Always Been Against This. And he has 2 theses. One is that fast forward into 20 years time, if you go to liberal, nice, fluffy institutions in Wisconsin-Madison or wherever, just like you will never find anybody who would ever support Jim Crow segregation, just like you would never ever find anybody who supports apartheid in Africa, so you will never find anybody who will ever defend what's happening in Gaza now. That's the first part of the thesis. The second one is that the effects this has on popular support outside of liberal democratic states for liberal democracy, because of the profound betrayal of liberal democratic values that have just evaporated because of a set of very strong material links between the Israeli state and political elites in a number of countries. So I would say we know liberal democracy by what it's not, and we know its importance by the energies and material and resources and wealth and treasure that's been invested into trying to subvert it. Sophie, Christian evangelical organization. So Olivia told me that I was running out of time, so I skipped over this. So it is the case that they do come up in our data. So there was a slide, I showed it very, very, very briefly. Effectively, just a couple of years after this kind of anti-BDS policy, repertoire, model, whatever, starts diffusing, there are a lot of efforts to connect ALEC with a series of Christian evangelical groups who provide resources to bring people together to then generate model legislation. So they do turn up just a little bit later. And I think that's what really characterizes this process. It's really messy and complex and ad hoc, and it's just a bunch of entrepreneurial individuals at outset. And then all these infrastructures and networks start to get activated, and then they start to kind of crystallize and sediment into something that looks a little bit more like a coherent actor, of which these Christian evangelicals are definitely involved. So thinking about the Supreme Court ruling around white Mississippi business owners and the NAACP, so there has been pushback against anti-BDS bills. I mean, they've been struck down in a number of US states. There's a really wonderful organization based in the United States called Palestine Legal, who are just like this incredibly heartwarming, incredibly energetic, smart group of people who have been working against this. The problem is that the Palestinian issue in the United States is an isolated issue. You know, there is this kind of cliche of liberal accept for Palestine, and I think that really holds true. And so, if as a social movement scholar, it strikes me that they lack the kind of political opportunities that other movements like the civil rights movement enjoyed. What to do with this paper? It's a fine question. I mean, the first author on the paper is a DPhil student, so I have narrow careerist interests for her that this should be published in a good journal, and so that she can put it on her CV and hopefully benefit from that. It's unclear now I think about it. The thing is, I would say is that this is actually very well documented. People know this. This is known. This isn't hard what we're doing. I mean, we're not. I mean, we did some. I'll talk about FOIA emails in a second, but this is all in plain sight. Nobody's hiding this. This is a known political fact, is my sense in this context. We're just packaging it and trying to empirically, kind of systematically untangle the kind of drivers and dynamics of it, and motivating it using literature and so forth, doing what I think political science should do, right? In the face of social problems, this is what I think I mean, maybe this is egotistical of me, but this is how I think political science adds value to the world. David, so I think I didn't explain this very well. So I take your point. So your argument is basically that over a very long time series, 365 emails is like very small numbers aggregated to different units of time. But that's actually not what we're doing. So the way that FOIA works in Illinois is that you have to have very, very strict search terms, because otherwise, if you cross a threshold of like how long it takes the civil servants to generate the data, this becomes a waste of public time, and so they won't give it to you. And so these are actually from a very narrow time window. These are from just around the policy window, late 2014 to the end of 2015. So they're just from a year. And so what we do is we FOIA'd the emails of all Illinois legislative staff who were involved in the composition of these bills, political staff. We have a vector, a list of like key emails that we think might be interesting, like Israeli state emails, AIPAC emails, and so forth. And then we use the keyword of the bill, which is, I've just written it down somewhere, SB 176. And so this network is a very tight network and if you look at the emails, this is a very fast-paced set of conversations that are unfolding where they're trying to piece together this legislation, and then they're trying to get it through. So that would be my kind of response to that concern. And then there's a question around how does previous acts of contention, how does other forms of mobilization feed into the formation of these kinds of networks that then engage in these kinds of anti-democratic practices? I think that's a fantastic suggestion. We've looked at that slightly in a different way, not related to contention, but actually often around anti-Iran initiatives that are also starting to appear in state legislatures at this point. But yeah, I think maybe there is something to this around campus activism, for example, that might be salient. Thanks.
Okay, I did know that was going to be the question, and thank you for pointing at the fact that you might need more historical understandings of what is going on. We cannot start by assuming ethnic primordialism regarding Southwest indigenous pueblos. These pueblos, since the colonial times, were reaccommodated, and a lot of changes have happened with them. And unlike other regions in Colombia, where you might have indigenous pueblos who have a different trajectory in terms of their culture, their relationship with the state. So first of all, we need to understand that some centuries pass for these people in which their legacies, their cultures were basically denied, and they were used to deny everything about them. So a lot of cultural change is in this process. So in anthropology, it's very hard, and it seems to me that in other social sciences, it's very hard to go beyond ethnic primordialism in order to understand social and political issues. So my idea here, and why to bring external authors, it is very important to decolonize the idea that you cannot think about ethnicity or culture or indigenous pueblos with different tools. I was reading a lot about ancient Greece. I was reading Nicole Leroux, a very important study about how in Greek society, at certain point, democratic ideas emerge. And it was very important to me to understand, for instance, the relationship between the death and the people who were doing this. And I was looking as an ethnologist who is trying to understand authority systems, political systems, without having a bias because I cannot use this or that in this field. So what is important to me is to understand that indigenous pueblos in Southwest Andes, and thank you for your comment on the constitutional change of 1991, we're working on this. This begins a lot in the 19th century with these indigenous pueblos begin their engagement with popular republicanism. Republicanism is very important for these indigenous peoples. They create alliances with dominant political elites from the liberal and conservative parties. They are basically they are part of the armed groups that liberal and conservatives create in order to, all this struggle that is going on in Colombia during the 19th century. So they have enough time to get into our politics and get into that and begin to think about coalitions, to think about doing things. And at the early 20th century, to think about, we talk about Indians, being Indians in a different way, and that's what they do. And when the constitutional change in 1991 happens in Colombia with the, what we can say state multiculturalism, they are recognized. They have some seats in the Congress. There is a special electoral circumscription. They begin to deal also with electoral politics, but all this is mixed together. And what I am saying is that they do value the idea of how you create power from your small bits of power, how you socialize that, how you make that collective. And you do that by a lot of assemblies, a lot of getting together, discussing, doing things in daily life. And that's very important because they do believe not in the idea of being separated, but being part of Colombia in terms of their legacies to be recognized in many senses. So that's the point. And how the limits of recognition in a society in which different has been a point, a violent side, because we are talking about a deep history of violence in Colombia, with different waves of internal armed conflict, especially in that region of Colombia where, there are many economic and social things going on. So that's the point, and thank you, because of course it needs a lot of more information. 15 minutes is too little, but that's my struggle, because with anthropologists, I am sick to death to be thinking about ethnic primordialism. I am not interested about that. And I am doing research that brings to the forefront these ideas of mixture, this idea of recreating the notion of pueblo, recreating the notion of community. My historical analysis was about a leader who did that. And I am also, very worried about the fact that in current political times, these kind of experiences are getting pushed to the side. Bolivian case is very different. There are many things that are different, but there is a common thing, and it is this idea that civil society can engage actively in, making these state reforms. And whenever it might happen. You can also have these counter hegemonic discourses. So that's it. Hopefully it gets more clear picture.
Yeah, thank you very much for your questions, which point to the right aspect, let's say. I'm going to give an honest answer, which is academically unprofessional, but I'm still going to be honest. I started my PhD as a job. My job was to look at the panel of the wise, at the practices, which is what I did in my data. And now I've gone through a journey of like theoretical frameworks, which I know is not what you should do, but this is what happened. So I looked at historical institutionalism, I looked at institutional practices, and actually, like, I hope to hand in my PhD soon, but I'm still struggling with exactly the theoretical framework I'm going to put it in. So actually right now I'm at a point where I see the African Union as the field and the panel of the wise as the practice of the African Union, because I think that the panel of the wise is kind of the joker card that the AU just points when they don't know what else to do. So they have this institution with the flexible mandate. It's not a great theoretical answer, but I'm still hoping for the illuminating idea, and I'm going to look at policy as practice. I've read Bourdieu, but it's been a while, and yeah, so that's my honest answer to the practice theory. I really have a love-hate relationship with that theory because I think it's useful in a lot of ways, but it's difficult to tie it up then and to make an academic salient point in a way. Your question about sanctions. It's the AU, they cannot do much, but Mali and Burkina Faso, they're excluded from the assembly. So basically they don't get to the table anymore, which the panel of the wise and the current members are actually disputing. So they are trying to bridge that and say, we should not leave them aside because then the situation is never going to change. And I mean, you can see what's happening in Western Africa with, there's a regional economic community, ECOWAS, and they have founded their own, the EAS. So these are all developments that the African Union is not in favor of. And so the panelists are trying with shuttle diplomacy and other missions to do that. But the member that was engaged in that is probably not going to be reappointed on the panel. So it's, yeah, they're doing what they can, but this is the answer about questions. And regarding Kenya, the honest answer is, I don't know what the difference is between the EU and the Carter Institute. I want to look more at elections after I submit my PhD and maybe for a publication. So thank you for that inspiration. But just to explain that every report starts with a trigger, let's say, and here it was the Kenyan elections, but in the report you don't find anything on Kenya. So actually they take it as like the decision of the assembly and the PSC, but then it's more about like, so what can we do at the African Union? And they put it to this very continental, larger context, which is interesting for some, but then useless if you really want to change something. So yeah.
Okay, we'll wrap up there, but thank you to all of the presenters, and I think now it's time for lunch. Okay, so we're ready. Welcome everyone to the final panel of today's conference. I hope you had a lovely lunch. I did. In this session, we'll be exploring the links between our mobilization and governance. So we have two speakers. We have Marine Poirier, who is a CNRS researcher in political science at the Aix-Marseille University in France, the Institute of Research and Studies on the Arab and Muslim Worlds, and currently a visiting researcher at the Alberto Lleras Camargo School of Government at the Universidad de los Andes. She studies the transformations of the Yemeni ruling class in the context of political crisis and armed conflict. And with us is also Massimo Ramaioli. He's an assistant professor in political science in the School of Social Sciences, Arts and Humanities at Al Hawain University in Ifrane, Morocco. Previously, he was an assistant dean in the School of Arts, Humanity and Social Sciences and an assistant professor in the Social Development and Policy Program at Habib University in Pakistan. He received a PhD in political science from Syracuse University, and his main research interests are Middle East politics, political Islam, Gramscian theory, and international relations theory. And he's also one of the Osun Fellows. So each presenter will have around 20 minutes to share their insights, and then we'll open the floor for questions and hopefully a dialogue with the audience. So please, Marine, if you want to start.
Thank you, Lucio. Okay.
Hi everyone. Okay, I'll try not to put you to sleep. It's not the great time. Hopefully this subject will wake you up. So I'm going to be talking about political elites' mobilization or efforts to revive state institutions during civil wars. And in Yemen today, like other protracted armed conflicts, restoring the state, reinstating government institutions in order to provide public services to a population in need. These are slogans that are mobilized by all warring parties. And it's been a core motto of the internationally recognized government, that is Yemen's government, that has been overthrown, or that was overthrown by the Houthi rebels after they took control of the capital Sana'a in 2014. And this government that was pushed to flee Sana'a, then Yemen, has attempted since 2015, for 10 years, to re-establish itself locally and to revive state institutions in its capital, its new capital, Aden. And here you see a cabinet meeting last summer in the city of Aden. So this interest for the internationally recognized government and the government's attempts to revive institutions and restore the legitimate state in Yemen is part of a broader and larger research that I've been doing for a few years now. And to put it broadly, I'm looking at what becomes of the state during an armed conflict, and looking at what civilian leaders do during a civil war where, well, most of the focus sometimes is on armed actors and the emergence of new institutions. So I'm looking at, let's say, the old institutions and what becomes of them in a context, of course, where, you know, the accumulation of military resources is central and becomes, central in the distribution of power. So it's a research I've been doing, doing interviews and observations with political elites since 2018, and based on previous knowledge of the Yemen ruling class, which I studied for my PhD in Yemen between 2007 and 2011. So to put it in the terms of the panel's title, let's say the question is, what becomes of state governance, in a situation dominated by armed groups? So by definition, a civil war is the coexistence on the same national territory of different social orders in violent competition. Okay, therefore, it is not at all a situation where institutions and bureaucracies disappear and vanish. On the contrary, civil wars are situations characterized by the multiplications of institutions and bureaucracies. And in Yemen, war has led to the emergence of rival institutions of government and the fragmentation of its territory, of course, with multiple competing factions each claiming they exclusively embody and govern the Yemeni state. So since 2015, there are formally two competing governments or social orders in violent competition in the country. You see on the map here, excuse the French, the Houthis, the rebel militias in the north who overthrew the government in 2014 and who control Sana'a, as well as the Hatched area here. So it's 1/3 of the territory and 2/3 of the population. The Houthis are supported by Iran. And on the rest of the country is the overthrown government, recognized internationally, that's why I say the internationally recognized government, who controls almost 2/3 of the territory in gray and is supported by a military coalition led by Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. The internationally recognized government is officially based in Aden, which was declared its capital in 2015, but also in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia, where the Yemeni president initially fled after the coup with along members of his government. So this is a very simplistic picture to present the situation, which is actually much more complex than this two parties opposition, as the anti-Houthi camp is very divided. And you see here on this ICG map, many competing factions within the internationally recognized government. Most importantly, I would say, the STC, the Southern Transitional Council, which controls Aden, the city, since 2019 and claims the independence of South Yemen and is supported by the United Arab Emirates. So all these different factions that you see in this area that is not controlled by the Houthis formerly merged in 2022 in a presidential leadership council composed of 8 members, led by President Rashad Al-Alimi on the picture here. So it's a new collective presidency meant to unify ranks with each competing faction that you saw on the previous slide, having now a position as vice president. Up to now, it's failed politically, especially with regards to improving security, the economy, or delivering public services. Why? Because there are enduring rivalries between these groups, especially between the internationally recognized government and the STC, the Southern separatists, in the city of Aden, the capital. And this power struggle has made it extremely difficult for members of the government and the Presidential Council to establish permanently again and gain foothold there. And I find it interesting that yesterday I was looking for pictures of President Alimi in Aden, and I couldn't find an equivalent picture of this one, which was taken in Taiz, which is his city of origin and which is much more in control by the IRG, as you see here. It's the little pocket in gray in the middle of Yemen or south. And because, most of the official images of him in his capital are him getting out of his aircraft or inside the presidential palaces, but there are no such poster of him hanging in the streets. I have the impression this is, it's double mic, okay. And so today I want to look more precisely at this specific situation of the internationally recognized government that is commonly referred to as the legitimacy, or also pejoratively as the government of hotels, Hukumat el-Fanadiq. And I will come back to this shortly. When I say internationally recognized government, of course, I englobe members of the presidency and of the cabinet. Just quick chronology, I was telling you the government was overthrown in 2014 by the Houthis. The president and the prime minister were kept under house arrest for months, and they resigned until they managed to escape and flee to Aden. They canceled their resignation and declared Aden the capital of the legitimate state of Yemen. And when the Houthis reached Aden a few weeks after, in March 2015, president and members of cabinet left Yemen for Riyadh in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, who launched its military intervention to push back the Houthis and defeat them and help restore what was called the legitimate authorities. So at first, it was a temporary relocation of the internationally recognized government in Riyadh, mainly in hotels and palaces provided by the Saudi authorities. Aden was liberated a few months after intense clashes and a lot of destruction. Prime Minister was the first one to come back in September to Aden and to announce the return of the cabinet and all the offices in the city, but it never occurred. Houthi rockets struck the hotel he was staying in, and the poor security conditions prevented a return of government. Also, I say the security conditions also because there was a major surge of Al-Qaeda and Islamic State attacks following the liberation of Aden in 2015. And 10 years later, in 2025, well, the situation is to a large extent the same. Government members have returned to Aden, but not permanently because of the power struggles with the STC, the Southern separatists, who still dominate the city. Illustrating this, you see here STC gunmen before the entrance of the presidential palace holding the Southern Yemeni flag. So Aden City is or has become a must stop, a visit for government members, but certainly it is not the main pole of influence and activity, and Riyadh still is the main pole. What's interesting, I find, as a political scientist, is it's not at all a typical government in exile, like the one studied in the literature. For example, what? Okay, like the Tibetan government in exile, studied by MacDonald, or Wilson studying the Sahrawi government in exile, or think also of the Polish opposition in France, studied by Dufoy, and the exopolity, which is like opposition space abroad. We're not at all in this type of government from abroad or at distance or in exile. First of all, because members of government are not in exile per se, they are in a situation of exile. They have sought refuge abroad, relocated temporarily in neighboring countries such as Saudi Arabia, Egypt, United Arab Emirates, Oman, Turkey, Jordan, but they are not asylum seekers. Here you see the different relocation of these political elites, with each regional hub having, notice this, characterized by specific political orientation, socioeconomic hierarchies and activities. I won't dig in this. What I want to insist on is that the government members can travel back to Yemen, and they do regularly. Some of them have their family members there. They who live permanently in Yemen, have not left Yemen since the beginning of the war. They often also continue to have businesses there, even in areas under Houthi control. Secondly, it's not a government in exile because although it has been unable to re-establish in Yemen permanently, it is not entirely based outside the country. It formally controls, as you've seen, well, the bureaucracies in 2/3 of the territory, these bureaucracies that contribute to making the state exist, although imperfectly. And so contrary to the Houthis in northern Yemen, who integrated state institutions, the pre-existent institutions after the coup, and who function as a de facto state quite effectively and can boast of a certain stability today, the internationally recognized government, on the other hand, has had to rebuild institutions in a territory that is divided between rival militias. Indeed, a lot of my interviewees talk to me about how Yemen as a centralized republic, well, when the Houthis made the coup and they had to flee, well, the internationally recognized government had to start from nothing in Aden. They say we had no offices, no ministries, no archives. We had to rebuild everything, start from scratch. It's building new offices for ministries. It's also a central bank. And of course, all of this is done with the support of its main sponsor, its main sponsors, Saudi Arabia and the Emirates. Saudi Arabia offered temporary offices in Riyadh, in palaces, 5-star hotels, while the United Arab Emirates invested in Yemen in the reconstruction business. It dominates. And supplied new infrastructures, luxury hotels too, where these government members can now convene. So in this context, the internationally recognized government is very much a nomad government, a government in transit based in hotels in and outside of Yemen, and characterized by intense mobilities of its members between Yemen and these neighboring countries, hosting countries and sponsors in so this regional space of Yemeni politics. It's also a largely absent government on the ground. And it has been coined, I was saying before, it has been coined, yeah, the government of hotels since 2015, since the beginning, and for 10 years now, by opponents, by the Houthis, of course, but also by its own supporters who criticize the fact that government members spend most of their time abroad in luxury hotels and palaces, living an idle life while Yemenis suffer the consequences of war. In 2020, a Yemeni MP based in Cairo complained that today the government, it's just a hotel suite. It's a group of individuals in a collection of hotel rooms in Riyadh. The presidency is an apartment and the presidential cabinet another apartment with 14 people. Is this a state? It's pathetic. Of course, so this member of parliament, is interesting because he actually stayed for 2 years in Riyadh before leaving and going to Cairo. He denounces the corruption of these elites, and there have been many outrage and scandals you can imagine around this situation, and a lot of press articles speaking about the 5-star exile of the president and his ministers who are comfortable in the Ritz Hotel, for example, yeah, accounts of the president and his cabinet eating meat, chewing cat at the expense of the Saudi government and residing and well, not really working, right, from these luxury hotels. And up till today, Saudi Arabia provides for salaries of this government, of the presidential council members, and of the state budget of this internationally recognized government. Provides accommodations and other retributions and facilities for these members that are mainly living abroad and who are paid in thousands of Saudi riyals each month. When, let's say, normal public servants in Yemen have no payroll or are not paid regularly. So there's been like, how long can this continue, right? There's been a shift as Saudi Arabia has been trying to put an end to this situation. 3 months ago, the president the chairman of the Presidential Leadership Council was kicked out of the Ritz Palace and the Carlton, and of the presidential suite. I don't know how you say this in English, suite. So there's been for many years now a process of pushing these government leaders out of hotels and into residential compounds in the suburbs of Riyadh. Some of them, of course, have also decided to leave and to find other accommodations in countries where it's more accessible financially, for example, in Cairo. So despite this, I mean, there's the comeback is very difficult in Aden, even if they are pushed to come back. I don't have much time, so I think I'll skip this maybe. It's just I wanted to tell you about the fact that first of all, in this is the presidential palace in Aden. There is still very little control, and security-wise, it's very difficult for these government members to work and be active in Aden. They are also stuck in hotels in Aden. This is the case of the president of parliament, who explained to me in 2022 that he was for Aden for a week for a visit to prepare a session of parliament, but he was not able to go out of the hotel for security reasons. And a few weeks later, members of parliament that were preparing the parliamentary sessions and the votes on the budget were expelled from the city by the Southern separatists a day before the budget vote was supposed to happen. And a few weeks ago, a journalist published a piece I really liked, entitled not the government of hotels, but speaking about the Yemeni Republic of Hotels, and describing Aden as the capital of goodbyes, where ministers and members of the Presidential Council are constantly passing through, making only temporary stopovers. To wrap up and conclude, why is this of interest? Well, for me, the question is, yeah, what does it tell us, or what is it the case of, and what does it tell us about how regimes and states are made and made during the war? What does it tell us also about the specific dynamics of the civil war in Yemen? Well, this government of hotels, or nomad government, is interesting for me for at least two reasons. First of all, I think it embodies very well the difficulties or the challenges for political and military leaders to embody the state symbolically and materially during the war. And whereas Houthis have been able to do this much more easily with appearance of unity and stability, we see it's very difficult in the unstable and fragmented order of the internationally recognized governments, with also competing representations within the government of what the state should be, and different state experience in Marib. I didn't have time to enter this, but in the tribal model in East Yemen, the Southern separatist model, and the internationally recognized government, which is very much in a confused nostalgia of what the state was, but really never was before the war. Also different, of course, representation of the state, if it should be unitary or not. Secondly, it's a great entry to apprehend the broader reconfiguration of the Yemeni political scene since the beginning of the armed conflict. More specifically, it really illuminates the transnationalization of Yemeni politics that are now in regional hubs. You've seen with the importance of regional patronage and a transnationalization of Yemeni politics that is not only like a five-star hotel, let's say, development, but also five-star prison and surveillance and control by regional sponsors. These groups have very limited autonomy. This is not something I entered here, but it's something I've been working on. How the patronage also creates a lot of constraints for these political figures. It also illuminates another aspect of the reconfiguration of the Yemeni political scene, which is the social transformation of its ruling class, with a lot of money flowing, enrichment, personal enrichment throughout the war, and the fact that a lot of political elites and representatives today do not wish to go back to Yemen, because also they have had access to a new life, to a new comfortable, to access to a cosmopolitan also lifestyle in secularized compounds in Riyadh, Cairo, or Abu Dhabi. And so this, for me, this expression and this government is really a good illustration of these broader dynamics that are transforming the political scene since for 10 years now. Thank you.
Hello. Okay. Thank you so much, Marin, for your presentation. Very insightful on the state making and governance and the making of regimes in civil war. And now is the time for Massimo.
Yes.
So the floor is all yours.
There's a conspiracy, it's not working. Okay, got it. I'm about to talk about Middle East, so might as well start with a conspiracy. Okay. Okay. All right. So thank you very much. I'm gonna close this, and we have had many great presentations today. So to conclude with mine, it's gonna be a little anticlimactic, okay? But still, I'll do my best. And it actually fits nicely with Marin's presentations, as we're both talking about instances where centralized state control is problematic, right? And we're still in the same neck of the wood in the Middle East, only a little bit further north than Yemen. So I am working on this project with a good friend of mine, Andre Banke. You may know him. He's a GIGA senior research fellow in Hamburg. And Andre, with whom I talked yesterday, allowed me to say the following: everything brilliant and fantastic you're gonna find in this presentation is me, and all the bad things and the unsupported claims, it's his fault. Okay, so let's operate under that logic. We would like to discuss a thing that is unfolding as we speak, because I'm sure you've read the news. There's a new government in Damascus since December the 8th of last year in 2024, and it is a jihadi Salafi government, i.e. the main group that took over Damascus belongs to a certain interpretation of Islam. And that's what we would like to explore briefly with you today. Now, very quick background. This is a preliminary research, which means that primarily I will present things we would like to explore. I was chatting the other day with Francesco how we shouldn't go to a conference asking people, what should I do with my paper? But that's pretty much what I'm going to do today, okay? So if you have suggestions, please let me know, okay? There is a draft of this work, but it's still very in its infancy. Eventually, we would like to publish this in a peer-reviewed article whenever we'll manage. And overall, we would like to primarily frame this as a piece of research of comparative politics. So that's the lens we would like to frame this as. And what I mean by that, let's take a step back. We're not going to delve much into state theory or anything like that, but just to see where we would like to locate our work, and possibly to say to the audience that we have actually something quite new to look at. So if you go all the way to the right, you have state governments. That's what usually political science studies, when you have a nice setup where you have your Congress, your president, or your monarch, depending what you have. You have established institutions. That's what we usually call a Weberian state, right? That kind of stuff that you study when you're a freshman in college. We know that. Otherwise, you are here in the ungoverned spaces. That's what, the likes of Thomas Hobbes really dislike, because that's anarchy. If you're in the Middle East, it's fitna or what have you, right? So between these two, you have all sorts of shades of gray. And I was fortunate enough here at the Colombian Hub to be in touch with Zaccaria Mampilli, who actually talked with us, who's a major scholar. I mean, he may be the first one who actually theorized a lot about rebel governments. When you have other formations, the likes that Marin was talking about, and the likes of FARC here in Colombia, and the examples around the planet are so many. But basically, you have chunks of the territory controlled by other people. You have different social orders present in the same territory. And we would like to say, and we are not sure yet, right, if these claims makes any sense, but there may be another additional shades of gray between a rebel government and a fully functioning state, which is the infancy of the new state. Basically, when you transition from rebel government onto that. What is this? Okay. Sorry, it's a conspiracy going on. Okay, so basically, I put this into italics because that's where we would like to locate our focus, right, in terms of comparative politics. Maybe there is something to be said between rebel government and Rafael. Yeah, okay. Now, we start our paper, Andre and I, with this little story, and we ask the reader to think about the following. You have an embattled country plagued by war, and all of a sudden, a small, obscure, radical extremist group all of a sudden makes a bid for power and, against all odds, takes control of the capital. And they are the bearers of an ideology so extreme and so radical that the rest of the international community considers them as pariah, people you shall not talk to because they're way too radical. And now you have this situation where the country is still embattled, is still in war, basically. You have this radical group ostracized by the rest of the international community that is not anymore a rebel group. They become actually the people who sit in the rooms of power. What are they going to do now that after asking for the piece of a cake to eat, now they actually have to eat the cake? They actually have to run the state. You wrote all these beautiful manifestos about how you're going to transform humanity and society. Now you can't do that. What do you do? And that's where the puzzle that we would like to address, a revolutionary government. And no. Yeah. Like this, that's exactly what I meant. Because the same story you could tell about 1917 Russia and 2024 Syria. And John is saying, no, with his head, but I know it, and I'm just for you, man. So we believe that there is something to be said about revolutionary governments, regardless how we feel about them in terms of their ideals and values and whatnot, in how they have to basically run politics in a country they have taken over. And there is something that, Andre asked me this morning when I shared with him this presentation, because I'm like, I wrote this radical rebel group in power for first time in history. And he's like, well, no, like the Taliban and ISIS were, well, hold on. The Soviets were the first of their kinds in power. That's why October 17 was such an incredibly revolutionary moment, because there had never been a communist regime in place. And you can say, well, in Paris, 1871, sorry, that lasted for 2 months, they took control of Montmartre. It's not the same thing, okay? I could say the same, that we never had a jihadi Salafi government before. The Taliban are not Salafis. They come from a different Deobandi Hanafi stuff. So they're not sharing exactly the same ideology. And if you say, well, all the Islamists are the same, I'm like, not really. They differ. And I like to say to my students, Moroccan students, ash-shaytan fi tafasil, the devil is in the details, right? So pay attention to. And you could say ISIS. sorry, ISIS to me was still a rebel group the way Mampili would define it, because they never took Damascus or Baghdad. They only controlled chunks of Syria and Iraq, just like a rebel group. So no, Ahmed al-Shara, the first guy that technically is a jihadi Salafi in control of a state in history, just like Vladimir Ilyich was the first communist in control of a state in history. So can we learn from Syria? Yeah, I think we can. I mean, that's my bet, at least. Again, first ever jihadi Salafi group to take over a state. And now it's interesting because we can ask, hey guys, what are you actually planning to do? What's your recipe? Which political institutions and government practices are you going to implement? And we can look at that also by considering the dynamics that will shape the evolution of a revolutionary state led by a radical movement. And here we have really to think about how we can draw from other examples in history, including Soviet Union, including other revolutionary governments that took over a state, right? Now, this is, a brief overview of the conditions under which the new government is operating in Syria. Things you can read also in the New York Times, or even better in the International Crisis Group, a good source for this kind of information. Syria basically has problems all over the place, so this is going to be a super quick summary. Security is the first one, economy, and then political transition. Not in order of importance, but just as a list for us to go through. So first of all, it's a good question to ask first and foremost if the war in Syria is actually over. Again, I don't want to stress too much the parallels with the Soviets, but after they took over in October 17, they had a 4-year-long civil war until 1921, and more people died in the Russian Civil War than in World War I in Russia. So in Syria, we may not have seen yet the real end of the war. First and foremost, Turkey and an affiliated military group, the Syrian National Army, is fighting against the Syrian Democratic Forces, which are basically the Kurdish that control part of the northeastern Syria. And actually these clashes, these fightings have escalated since Ahmed al-Shara took power with this group in December. Second, of course, they're all over the Middle East all the time. So as the new government took power in Damascus, Israel violated the buffer zone on the Golan Heights. Golan Heights are basically, huge hills between Syria and Israel, and there is a UN buffer zone there to prevent the two armies, to get into direct contact. Israel violated that zone and then took over some other parts of Syria proper, including Mount Hermon, which is the highest point of Syria, is 2,800 meters. Not only you control the Golan Heights from there, from a military standpoint, you also look down over Damascus, controlling easily the telecommunication in the areas. And why not? In March 2025, Bibi Netanyahu declared that southern Syria should be a demilitarized zone, and like every demilitarized zone in the world is going to be one of the most militarized zones in the world. If you know anything about Korea, it's going to be pretty much the same. And it's not here, but I couldn't resist, because Netanyahu also declared that he intervened in Syria in order to protect the Syrian Druze from the government in Damascus, which it made me think immediately to what the French would say in Lebanon during the 19th century. They were intervening to protect the Maronites because they were fellow Christians. Like, I already heard this story before, okay? Last, our best friends from ISIS, okay? They are defeated as a military group, but not as a crime cartel, basically, or as a terrorist group. And they have ramped up attacks against both the Kurdish SDF forces and US troops. And yes, the US maintains around 1,200 soldiers, and we're talking about elite troops in Syria, down from some 2,000 of a few months back. But basically, the Kurds are still fighting ISIS affiliates together with some US troops in northeastern Syria. Still about security, and I decided to separate these two slides. We may have issues of ethno-sectarian violence going on still. I'm not going to venture into describing every single pocket of color that you see on the right, but basically, as most Syria experts were fearing, especially in this area, in the Syria northwest, where most of the Alamites community resides, these were the people that supported the earlier regime, right? So it's a long story. We don't need to get into that. But basically, ethnic clashes exploded in early March. Basically, Sunni Syrians taking revenge over what they considered supporters of the former regime. Some 1,300 people died, and most of them were civilians in the Alawites areas. And then down in the south, the already mentioned Druze, right? So these purple-ish pockets, we have witnessed clashes between their own groups, their own militias, and affiliated militias affiliated with the central government. When I use the acronym HTS, it refers to the group that Ahmed al-Shara was leading, the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the Committee for Liberation of Syria, right? Dozens of casualties. So neither from the point of view of external actors like Turkey and Israel, neither from the point of domestic dynamics, Syria is pacified at the moment. Moving on, the economy. Security is bad, probably the economy is worse. 80% of the population live now below the poverty line. The data are even starker when you compare GDP of Syria in 2024 with GDP in Syria in 2011. In 2011, when the uprisings, revolts against Bashar al-Assad started, we're talking about a 40% decrease in GDP, which is nothing but staggering. Almost half the population of Syria, some 9 million people, have been displaced, either internally or in neighboring countries, Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, partially in Iraq as well. We do not know, of course, the statistics precisely, but you also have some 500,000 people dead because of the war, and uncertain numbers of wounded and permanently traumatized, possibly. So that's basically the, to use a not very sympathetic title, but human capital you have to work with, okay, to revive your economy. Good luck. Large-scale destruction of infrastructures, of course, hospitals, schools, roads, all the rest. Reduced international aid. We all know about USAID, which was mentioned today as well. And there is still the issue of sanction relief, because when Bashar al-Assad, the former dictator of Syria, for those of you who are not familiar with the country, started violently repressing the popular uprising, the international community, primarily the United States, applied very strong sanctions against Syria. Now, Bashar now is gone, but the sanctions were still in place until our great president, Donald Trump, shook hands with Ahmed al-Shara in Riyadh a few days back, saying, "Don't worry, man, I'm going to take care of this. Sanctions will be lifted from Syria." The problem remains that it's hard to send aid to Syria because Ahmed al-Shara and his organization are still technically considered terrorists. So probably it was the first instance ever where U.S. president shook the hands of a terrorist in for the globe to see. I have to rush because Rocio gave me the 5-minute mark. Transition process, political institutions. What do you do in terms of what kind of country you will build, right? And we have had a constitutional declaration in the mid-March 2025, which basically seemed to lay out the template of a highly centralized presidential system that doesn't give us many other indication about how the country will be ruled. They were at most lip service to issues of minority and gender rights. They were very vague on that. And he said, and by he I mean the current president, self-proclaimed president, said that the new constitution, hopefully a democratic constitution, should be voted in 4 years from now. And a lot of people were like, it's a little too long, 4 years, okay? Also, security forces, you have to establish an army and a police force, who's going to staff that police? The former Ba'athist compromised with the regime, or the guerrilla members of various formations, including the HTS? And you have also a bunch of foreign fighters that are now in Syria. I actually spoke no more than 5 days ago with an Italian kid who studied in Torino, in Turin, who went to Syria for fun a month ago. He's an interesting guy. And he told me that he was in Damascus. He was walking on the streets. I should have asked him to pass him some pictures. And there were all sorts of militiamen asking him to take pictures of them. And I'm like, what language did they speak? And like, they were not Arabs. A lot of them were Turks, some Chechens, some other people you could not identify. And it was like, the only thing you couldn't do with them, or you better not do, is to speak Persian. He's now in Tehran. He's studying Farsi, but Persian is not now a currency for being welcome in Syria, given the previous association of the regime with Tehran. Last but not least, transitional justice. Which stories, which judicial and historical truth are you going to establish your nation on? Also, the problem with HTS, because if you're going to try people for war crimes, well, those people were Salafi jihadis who did also nasty things. Okay. So basically, what we would like to explore is what are the plans and projects of the government given these conditions? How ideology, and I didn't speak much or at all about Salafi, jihadi Salafi ideology here. We can do that a little bit in the Q&A, but how much ideology will shape their politics and how much pragmatic considerations will, okay? And I'll leave it at this, and I thank you guys for your attention. I hope, Professor, I did well. Great, thank you so much.
Okay, thank you both for your presentations. I think there are many possible links to be made between the making of political regimes in the Middle East. So yeah, we will now open the floor for questions. So I can see a question right there. So 1, 2, 3. Okay, let's go with these 4. Did I see? Okay, these 4 questions. So Jan first.
Yeah. I can shout as well. All right. Thank you. No, the first and nicer questions to Marim. Actually, for especially for Houthis and their relationship with Iran. So let me come to the point with an example, because I was working some time ago on the issue of proxy warfare and proxy fighters, etc. And my point has always been that it's not simply that Iran is telling Houthis to do that, and I don't know, like whatever is the sponsor's state telling the proxy fighter to do this and that. So I have some kind of understanding in relation to that, particularly in terms of Houthis and their relation with Iran. But are they simply proxies, or they have their own agency? I'm putting it bluntly so that you answer me in details. And the second question is also a simple one. What keeps the others in power? Like, if they're all, I mean, I'm talking about the social power that that is somehow existing in the country, right? In the rest of the country, like they're in Riyadh, they're in hotels, but what is their social base? Like, do they have anything to do with society? So it's also a simple but difficult one. So these are the questions for Marine. And Massimo, well, there are factually incorrect information that you were sharing. For instance, I'll give 2 examples, but there are other issues that we can discuss if you like later. SDF is not Kurdish. 60% of SDF is non-Kurdish. 60%. Yes, the commander happened to be Kurdish. It is because of some historical reasons, because the Kurds were much better organized than the other groups. And all Alawites were not supportive of Assad. Actually, Assad being Alawite doesn't mean that Alawites were doing better off. Rather, Alawite were like Assad regime was a dictatorship who was connected to some, some strong families, those who live in hotels, like in case of Yemen, and these were Sunnis and Alawis, so Alawites. So these are like factually incorrect informations that I wanted to correct them. And there are several others that we can discuss if you like later. One thing is that actually, I don't know why you call it a revolutionary government or not. I mean, there's a full, I was teaching a course that I prepared, that revolutions in world politics. So there is plenty of revolutionary governments. You gave just example of Soviet Russia. There are plenty of revolutionary governments in history, and some of them they did well, some other did like shit, but there have been many revolutionary governments. And I don't know what is your contribution conceptually by calling it, so this is my question, what is your contribution conceptually by calling it a revolutionary government without even looking into the entire history of revolutionary governments? This is another point. And one more thing is that, when we're talking about, I mean, we have to be conscious of who is doing what. So jihadism is basically, I mean, it can be something, I mean, it has social base, I'm not denying that. But jihadism in and of itself is a genocidal thinking. It's a genocidal regime because it is against any kind of difference that is different than itself. And then it makes it a genocidal regime. And when you take revolution only and merely as taking state power, and then the one who takes power as the revolutionary, you just legitimize or at the very least, you make the rest of it unseen. And this is not okay, in my opinion. Like, we need to be serious, and we need to be serious about calling something revolutionary or not. And revolution is not only something, I mean, I really suggest, I have plenty of references that I can share with you. Revolution is not something that we can use like technological revolution, AI revolution, this revolution, that revolution. Yeah, I mean, it becomes like a, empty, empty signifier for telling anything and nothing eventually. So I would say that when we approach particularly jihadis, I'm not talking about political Islam. I'm particularly talking about jihadism. So not to make my not to mix up the things. And one more thing, and this is the last one. Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, its arrival to the power is not at all a question of all of a sudden. It is a historical accumulation, first of all, and then conjunctural, how you call it, conjunctural emergence, if you like. They have been under the protection of Turkey for a really long time, and they have been doing their position back then was rebel governance with the support of Turkey in Idlib, and so there's a full history of that. And I think for instance, majority of the ministers that are now actually Syrian ministers were also ministers or leading people in Idlib government back in the days. So you were claiming that where did they come all of a sudden? So this is a response to that. I don't think that it's a question of all of a sudden. I have like 50 other points, but I'll stop here for the moment. Thank you.
Thank you both for the interesting presentations. Actually, a question for each. Maureen, just had one quick question. I don't know enough about Yemen so this may be an obvious question. I apologize for that. You mentioned how the internationally recognized government is kind of living off nostalgia, that it's kind of looking for a past that wasn't really there. I guess my question is, its supporters, particularly the Saudis and the Emirates, is there a particular reason why they've continued to support this group that seems to not really have much strength in some ways, that they haven't switched over to another faction or anything like that? Just out of curiosity, was wondering what was kind of kept them with that group that seems sort of out of place. And then Massimo, I really liked your presentation, honestly. I think it's pretty awesome. One question and maybe something to think about sort of expanding out a little bit is kind of on this question of revolution. Because yeah, I mean, when I was hearing about the first example being the Russian Revolution, at first I was thinking, oh, this makes sense. But then was also thinking, well, but what do we say about the French Revolution? Or what do we say about some of the earlier ones? What I'm wagering is that they have a very sort of specific idea of what revolution would be, which is great. Just it might need to be sort of fleshed out a little bit more, or because this notion of a revolutionary government seems like it'd be very profitable and very good, maybe looking at how it could be, is it sort of a spectrum, sort of going from, say, revolutions that start at least partially through the path of legality, like maybe inside France, or even to a certain extent, say, Germany in the bad old days, the March on Rome with the Italians, to full out, you're in the middle of a civil war or an anti-imperialist war like in China, and then moving on from there to taking over the capital. Yeah, I mean, again, it seems like it's something to have a lot of legs, but I was just wondering, is there a specific kind of revolution you have in mind that you're wanting to kind of operationalize here?
Okay, question for Marine. So you made a big, you talked a lot about the distinction between governments in exile and the governments of hotels. And I wanted to, and I'm sure it's in the paper, but push you to flesh out a bit more. Is it a question of symbolism? So because they're still on national territory, does that raise citizen expectations about what the state should and could do? Does it make them look even weaker because they're in domestic hotels? So they're imagining this other counterfactual where they could be fighting more forcefully? Or is there a different type of reference category? I was just interested in what you think it is, or does it change their mode of operation vis-a-vis sort of these other governments who've been in exile, again, knowing nothing about the context? But I thought that was really interesting, and I've certainly seen leaders in hotels negotiating where there's a lot going on in very close proximity, and you can't help but say this is such a weird juxtaposition. So I wanted to hear more about what that means for citizen perceptions to see this government of hotels.
Oh, hi. Thanks both of you for the great presentations. I have questions for both of you. Marine, I suppose my question is, what is this a case of? So it strikes me when you talk about a government of goodbyes, I think it was, and you mentioned that these are political elites who don't want to be in Yemen. This doesn't sound like a state in waiting. This doesn't sound like an exiled political force who are waiting just for the opportunity to come back and stamp their project onto the society. This sounds like a rentier class who are living in hotels, who are benefiting from a kind of strategic rent of the kind that we saw with the Palestinians at various points prior to the 1990s, to various other revolutionary, revolutionary Ba'athist, pan-Arabist political forces who would enjoy enormous support from the Gulf so that they could provide a political function, but not so they could actually be really political themselves, in a sense. And I wonder whether this is. I just think it would be helpful to get a sense of whether you agree with that, because this idea of performing the state. I mean, they're performing the state so they can get this rent, but they're not actually. They don't have a political project. It sounds like, except to enjoy the nice hotels. Massimo, so I'm going to disagree with Jan here. I think that seeing groups like Hayat Tahrir al-Sham as a revolutionary is completely uncontroversial in the literature now. People like Stathis Kalivas, Stephen Walt, George Lawson, and others have all written at length about precisely this issue. If we think about revolutionary mobilization as anti-systemic, with a mass base, seizes power through extra institutional means. We're agnostic to ideology in this context. So I'm totally with you on this. I guess the point of clarification that I wanted is, what are we gaining by placing revolutionary states within this distribution of what I read as being effectively state capacity? I read that as saying that state capacity is a distribution from you have zero to you have lots, and sometimes you have contested situations where there's, and so it wasn't totally clear to me on that spectrum what you get from moving from a civil war situation from just having a functioning state. So that was the point of clarification that I guess I wanted. And then a suggestion. It strikes me that what you're describing is what Ferdinand Eibel calls the founding moment of regime formation, in which you have this moment of just incredible uncertainty. It's like this temporal episode in which everything is very uncertain and parlous, and where you've got real serious constraints on the people who have seized power. Can they run the state? Do they have the operational procedural knowledge to run the state? And a set of incentives as well. They want to see off counter-revolution, and they want to have transformative projects, and they want to keep the show on the road. They want to keep the schools running and so on and so forth. And so I wonder what you're really talking about is this particular moment of regime formation after state capture, in which these constraints and incentives are particularly acute. And then you start to see particular political calculations and logics of the kind that you describe.
Okay, many insightful questions or comments. I realize we're running a little bit over time, so if each of you can answer maybe in 2 or 3 minutes.
Thank you. Yes, Jan, I mean, no, the Houthis are not Iranian proxy. It's overstated. Of course, there is ideological, political, material support, but much more or less than the support of Saudi Arabia or the Emirates to the factions and the other camp. And there is no control and no ambition from Iran to control the Houthi project, which is a very national political project, although it has regional, international ambitions, has had for the last year and a half. The other questions, many lead to the same problem of the social base, right? So you said, yeah, do they have a social base, and how do they maintain the link with their social base? Well, to answer you, of course, they are in a situation where there's a geographical break. I mean, there have been. Now, many have been able to go back to Yemen, so they are getting back to their bases when they can access, for example, for members of parliament, which I've studied a lot. Not all have access to their constituencies, because some of them are under Houthi control. But those who have access are back. Many have, during their time abroad, continued to maintain links with their social base by sending money, following, you know, the public course of affairs. Like they have like 3 phones ringing all the time, helping people. There's someone who's in a prison, how to get him out. This is the son of who needs a grant to go study abroad, etc. So from abroad with WhatsApp, they function a lot like this. They are keeping this link. And then locally, amid the diasporas in the countries where, or in the cities where they have relocated. And in Cairo, for example, members of parliament especially have really started helping a lot the fellow Yemenis. It's now their job. They cannot provide in Yemen, so they provide for Yemenis abroad. Yeah, there was two, and of course, for them providing and going back, restoring institutions is key because yeah, their capacity to provide or to perform the state and show that they might be able to provide, because until now they have very little provided, is central in the intra-elite competition within Yemeni elites, and also for their own legitimacy in a context where demands have exploded locally with the war and the humanitarian situation. For example, last week there were huge mobilizations in Aden of Yemeni women. They called it the Revolution of Women. And the demands were because of the electricity cuts, more than 18 hours a day of no electricity in a city where it's very hot and the summer is coming. And one of the slogans was, we want governmental electricity, not commercial electricity. And so there's a lot of demand for the states to provide. So the expectations are huge. and yeah, I'm trying, so until now, this is a very, I mean, I thought about this government of hotels, and I thought it would be a good idea to think about it and make it a case of something. It's not an object I've really thought about before. It's only for this conference that I try to organize my thoughts, and because I've worked more on the members of parliaments, on political parties, and the political parties' representatives or members of parliament, they are not in a state of waiting. They very much want to go back and provide and continue act locally, politically. They're very frustrated, and but these members of government and the government of hotels, of course, is very much, as you said, Neil, rentier state, rentier class, only performing the state or seeming only to perform the state to get the money. So I agree with this. I agree with you. I think this is a different case in this respect with what I've been studying before. And I arrived to the conclusion that it seems that no, they are not willing to go back, actually, which is not, as I was saying, the case of members of parliament or other. I've got cases of many members of parliament who for 2-3 years now are back in Aden or in Maha, but no minister. Of course, I think we could be useful to make a distinction because until now I have made a few interviews with ministers, but mainly with how do you say, the Mudir Maktab, director of office, and these are much more on the ground people and do not live in the Ritz-Carlton. They have left Riyadh early on because they didn't have the means to sustain like financially, and now they are mainly based in Cairo, and do not live at all the same lives. So, but it's really an interesting thing because there's a lot about this government of hotels, and there's a lot, I think, also of imagination about what these people are living, and it would be interesting to actually dig in and really be more precise about the materiality of these idle lives. Finally, just on the nostalgia and why Saudi Arabia and EAU continue to support their internationally recognized government. Well, now they have formed a kind of puppet governments. I mean, today, since 2022, the new Presidential Leadership Council, it's all their players. The president, the chairman of the Presidential Council is a very strong ally of the Saudi. He's a pro-Saudi, but it's been for years. He was former Minister of Interior. He's seen as a Saudi puppet. And the other vice presidents, the 7 vice presidents, are all the leaders of factions that have emerged. They are all military representatives of militias or leaders of militias that have emerged during the war with the support of the Saudi Arabia and the Emirates. This is the case of the STC, but also of the Hadramaut Council or of the National Resistance in Maha.
Thank you. I'll start with Jean's comments on the factual mistakes. And not that I want to excuse myself, for the sake of experience, Jean, I said, okay, Turkey SNA against the Kurdish SDF. Totally right. The SDF is not entirely Kurdish. The cadre, the leadership, I understand, are Kurdish. I'm not an expert on the Rojava situation. And just to plow through quickly, I mentioned Kurdish. So you're totally right on that. So it was an inaccuracy, at least on my part. The other one on the Alawites, I thought I said the following, but if it didn't reach your ears, then it was my responsibility. The Alawites were considered by some other Syrians to have supported and to have benefited from the regime. Some Alawites benefited from the regime, some Alawites loved the regime, other Alawites couldn't care less, and other Alawites just were caught in the crossfire during those clashes. The fact that Bashar al-Assad family came from the Alawite community, there is no serious scholar who would make the claim that, oh, it was an Alawite regime. But the enemies of the regime portrayed the regime as an Alawite regime. So when security broke down, they said, oh, now it's payback time, and we're going to have the Alawites pay for the crimes of the regime. And they killed women and children. So yeah, but your point is well taken on both accounts, and that was my rush through the presentation. On the revolutionary governments, I'm going to ask you a favor. If you give me your syllabus, whatever you're compliant, I'll be happy to look at it, because absolutely, Jean. What I may differ from you on is the qualification of jihadism as necessarily a genocidal movement, because I don't think we have evidence for that. ISIS had genocidal traits, fair enough, but there are many jihadis who are not out to kill people indiscriminately. Most jihadis, to me, resemble more the Red Brigades that I talk about a lot with Francesco. Violent, militant, uncompromising. Genocidal is something different. And to me, not all jihadis, and I would say the majority of jihadis, are not necessarily genocidal. Also, we're talking about jihadi Salafis. So there is this marriage between a particular ideology that has a certain epistemology that has some of the traits you indicated, Jean, in terms of exclusive access to truth, uncompromising attitude, even at an ideological level, that makes them very unreceptive of pluralist positions, right? But genocidal, just as I hear your warning, we have to use revolution carefully. I would say also genocide must be used very carefully, right? When it comes to revolution, yeah, I'm thinking, right, as I was hearing your considerations, what is actually a revolution? And I mean, it's one of those terms in political science literature, like democracy, terrorism, revolution, state. We can stay here for another 25 years and we will not come out with an agreement. And we will not. Sorry, I meant 25 seconds, Francesco. Sorry. To me, was revolutionary in a very basic sense, and perhaps that's what Neil was mentioning. There's been a change of regime, and it's very likely that the social, political, and institutional setup of power will change. And we usually adopt the term revolution to differentiate from a simple change in regime composition or government, right? And then we can really think about what do we mean by revolution, and I hear you on that. But in this case, I think revolution was appropriate for me to use that term. Last, still on revolution, and I can combine perhaps both Neil's question and Philip's question. On Neil's point, yes, indeed. If I have that continuum, it's just a continuum from basically no state capacity, because there is no state to speak of until we reach, Switzerland or Denmark or whatever you on the other side. It's just a degree of statehood that we're talking about, or there are some qualitative steps whereby a certain degree of quantitative step will engender a qualitative shift. And Neil, if you are so kind to send me via email the author you mentioned, because as you've seen, I have no notebook with me because I forgot it at home, but I'll be very happy to receive both Jean's syllabus and your suggestion when it comes to that. And, linking back last with Philip's question, why this revolution only to be cited, as also what Jean mentioned and not others? First of all, I thought it was a cool comparison, right? Yeah, I thought it was cool, Lenin and Afshar. Okay, that's it. There are many other revolutions, but I love that one particularly to have as a comparison. And I think we can, I would like to dig a little bit deeper into these guys were the first of their kinds to attain power. I can also make the case that Castro and Che Guevara had a very similar thing going on, but they had a blueprint. There were plenty of communist regimes by 1959. There's never been a jihadi Salafi regime. There's never been a Bolshevik communist regime. So I don't know if that's enough to make a contribution. Probably not, but it's something for me to think about. And yeah, I think that's it. And John, we're going to have a coffee because I'm sure you're not satisfied with my answers, but that's just, but we love him exactly because of that. So can we conclude with not on love to amongst the fellows? Yeah, okay.
Okay, thank you so much, everyone. I think we could stop here and continue the conversation later, tomorrow.